An empire without a king. No crown, no royal palace, no vast farmland to feed it. Just a cluster of wooden houses built on mud, rising out of a shallow lagoon on the edge of the sea. How does a place like that become one of the most powerful maritime states in the world? This is the story of Venice. A city born in the water, ruled by merchants, and held together not by a dynasty, but by carefully crafted laws, councils, and contracts. For roughly 1,000 years, Venice stood as a maritime republic, projecting its influence from the swamps of northern Italy to the markets of Egypt, the islands of the Aegean, and the harbors of the Black Sea. To understand how Venice became a maritime empire, we have to begin in a world that did not look imperial at all. In late Roman times, the northern Adriatic coast was dotted with towns like Aquileia, Altinum, and Oderzo. Inland, there were roads, fields, and stable settlements. Out in the shallow lagoon, there were only small scattered communities of fishermen, duck hunters, and salt workers. The lagoon was a working environment, not yet a political center. That relative calm did not last. In the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was collapsing. Invasions and civil wars shook the Italian peninsula. One of the most traumatic episodes came when Attila the Hun led his forces into northern Italy in the mid-5th century, attacking cities like Aquileia and driving people away from the exposed mainland. For many families, the low, muddy islands of the lagoon offered something the land no longer could, a place that was hard for large armies to reach. At first, this movement into the lagoon was not a single organized migration. It was a series of emergency decisions. A wealthy family from Altinum might send relatives to Torcello or Mazzorbo. Traders from Oderzo might move their goods to a safer island landing spot. Farmers and townspeople arrived with whatever they could carry, hoping that the water and marshes would protect them from raiding parties. Over time, these temporary shelters became more permanent, and the small, pre-existing communities of fishers and salt makers grew into larger settlements. The crisis deepened in the 6th century when another Germanic people, the Lombards, entered northern Italy. Their invasion began in the later 6th century and led to the creation of a Lombard kingdom based in Pavia. Unlike the Huns, who passed through and moved on, the Lombards stayed and took control of much of the mainland in the region known as Venetia. This made the distinction between land and lagoon even more sharp. On the mainland, Lombard rulers and their warriors seized towns and countryside. Out in the lagoon, communities remained connected to the distant Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire. This division was formalized when the Byzantine authorities created the Exarchate of Ravenna in the late 6th century. The Exarch, based in Ravenna on the Adriatic coast, was the imperial governor for Italy. The lagoon islands became part of this Exarchate. That meant that, at least on paper, the lagoon settlements were still under the Roman emperor in Constantinople, not under the Lombard kings. In practice, the Exarchate could not always intervene directly in local affairs, but the formal connection mattered. It gave the islanders a legal identity as subjects of the empire and helped them keep links with the broader Mediterranean world. The Lombard advance continued to push people toward the water. When the mainland city of Oderzo finally fell to Lombard power in the early 7th century, its population scattered. Many of its inhabitants fled to nearby lagoon centers such as Heraclea and Aquilium, which remained under Byzantine protection. These refugees brought with them skills, capital, and social networks. They were not only poor peasants. They included artisans, traders, clergy, and members of local elites. In this way, the lagoon communities became more complex and more urban. One good example is Torcello in the northern lagoon. Archaeology and written sources suggest that Torcello emerged as a major settlement around the time of the late Roman collapse and early medieval invasions. People from Altinum and other mainland centers moved there in search of safety. By the 7th century, Torcello had its own cathedral, Santa Maria Assunta, and served as a local religious center. The Bishop of Altinum moved his seat to Torcello, bringing relics and church treasures with him. That decision shows how seriously people were taking the new reality. They no longer expected to return quickly to their old mainland cities. The lagoon had become home. These changes were not only about fear and flight, there were also economic reasons for building in the lagoon. The shallow waters and tidal flats were ideal for salt production, which was a valuable commodity across the region. Salt was essential for preserving food and for many crafts. The combination of salt pans, fisheries, and small-scale trade routes gave the islanders a modest but stable economic base. As the population grew, the communities needed more boats, more storage facilities, and more contacts with the outside world. That, in turn, encouraged them to think beyond survival and to start organizing for trade. Politically, the lagoon was still fragmented. Different islands had their own local leaders, often called tribunes. These tribunes represented the interests of their communities and dealt with the exarch in Ravenna. There was no single ruler of all the lagoon settlements yet. Still, the fact that they shared a legal framework as Byzantine subjects and faced common threats from Lombard forces and occasional Frankish pressure pushed them slowly toward cooperation. The environment also shaped how people lived and governed. Building on soft, waterlogged ground required specific techniques. Houses were raised on wooden piles driven into the clay. Pathways, jetties, and canals had to be maintained continuously. Floods, shifting channels, and changes in sea level constantly threatened to undo human effort. In such conditions, coordination was essential. Communities had to work together to maintain embankments, dredge canals, and protect their small pockets of dry land. That practical cooperation would later support more formal political cooperation. The lagoon's geography offered both protection and limitation. On one hand, the shallow waters and sandbars made it difficult for large armies and heavy cavalry to approach. The same marshy obstacles that frustrated invaders also made it hard for the Lombards to project stable authority onto the islands. On the other hand, the lagoon offered almost no farmland. Grain and other staples had to come from the mainland or from trade. That dependence on external supplies pushed the islanders toward a life linked to boats and markets. Sea routes were not just a choice, they were a necessity. Religious life both reflected and reinforced the new communities. As bishops moved their sees into the lagoon, churches and monasteries became important centers of both faith and administration. The transfer of relics and sacred objects symbolized a broader transfer of identity. People were moving not only their bodies and goods but also their spiritual and civic loyalties from the old Roman towns to the new island settlements. In the process, a distinct lagoon society began to form, with its own saints, its own local traditions, and its own sense of being different from both the Lombard mainland and other Byzantine territories. Trade connections with the wider Mediterranean were never completely broken. Because the lagoon remained under nominal Byzantine rule, ships could still move between the islands and ports further south and east. Goods from the eastern Mediterranean, sometimes called Oriental products in the sources, passed through this zone. Over time, these flows attracted the attention of both Lombard and Frankish elites, who wanted access to the same goods. The lagoon communities were learning a basic lesson that would shape their future. Being at the junction between different powers and regions could be dangerous, but it could also be profitable if managed carefully. By the late 7th and early 8th centuries, the social and political landscape of the lagoon had been transformed. What had begun as dispersed fishing and salt stations had become a chain of settlements with churches, markets, and local elites. The population included refugees from various towns, long-established islanders, and newcomers drawn by opportunity. They shared a common dependence on the water, an official link to the Byzantine Emperor, and a growing habit of local self-organization. Conflicts sometimes broke out between different island communities over status, resources, and alignment with outside powers. Heraclea and Aquilium, for example, rivaled each other for leadership within the lagoon. These tensions, combined with pressure from Ravenna and from mainland rulers, created an unstable but dynamic situation. It was in this context that the idea of choosing a single leader for the lagoon as a whole began to take shape. By the early 8th century, the scattered communities of the lagoon were no longer just hiding places. They were organized settlements with their own interests, their own elites, and growing confidence. The question was no longer simply how to survive, but how to govern themselves and how to deal with powerful neighbors on land and sea. Out of this question emerged one of the most distinctive institutions in European history, the Venetian dogeship. The term doge came from the Latin word dux, meaning leader or commander. In other parts of the former Roman world, a dux might be a military officer appointed by the emperor. In the Lagoon, the title slowly took on a different meaning. Here, the leader was not just an imperial official sent from far away. He was, at least in principle, chosen by the local communities to represent them. Early sources are confused and sometimes legendary about the first office holders, but by the 8th century, we can see a pattern forming. The Lagoon settlements were beginning to act together as a political body, and the Doge was the visible sign of that unity. At this stage, Venice was still officially part of the Byzantine world. The Exarch in Ravenna remained the highest imperial authority in Italy, and the emperor in Constantinople still claimed sovereignty over the Adriatic coast. Yet the reality on the ground was changing. Communication across the sea took time, and imperial resources were stretched thin by wars in the east and internal religious disputes such as iconoclasm. In that space between theory and reality, the Lagoon elites had room to maneuver. The Doge could present himself as the guardian of imperial interests locally, while also defending the particular needs of the island communities. The position was attractive, but dangerous. A Doge who pushed too hard against imperial authority might be denounced as a rebel. A Doge who followed Constantinople too closely might lose the support of powerful families in the Lagoon. On top of that, a new power was rising on the western side of the Alps. The Frankish kingdom, under rulers such as Charles Martel and later Charlemagne, was expanding into central and northern Italy. As Frankish authority grew, the Lagoon found itself caught between two large spheres of influence, the Byzantine East and the Frankish West. This tension came to a head as the Lombard kingdom on the mainland weakened. The Lombards had long been the immediate neighbors and threats to the Lagoon settlements. When the Franks moved against Lombard power and eventually absorbed their kingdom, they did not just take over land, they inherited ambitions in the region. The Adriatic coast and its trade routes now looked attractive to a powerful dynasty that wanted connections to the wider Mediterranean world. For the Venetians, this shift meant that their inland frontier was no longer with a regional kingdom, but with a much larger Frankish empire. The Doges had to respond with a careful mix of diplomacy and self-defense. They began to negotiate more directly with the Frankish rulers, trying to secure recognition of Venetian autonomy while not breaking entirely with Byzantium. This balancing act was not only about foreign policy. Internally, the Lagoon elites were deciding what kind of political community they wanted to be. Were they still simply imperial subjects, or were they something more like a self-governing republic under a distant emperor? One sign of this internal evolution was the movement of the political center within the Lagoon. Earlier, power had been concentrated in places like Heraclea and Malamocco, closer to the mainland and more directly exposed to land-based threats. Over time, the focus shifted toward the cluster of islands around Rialto, which offered better protection and easier control of access to the Lagoon. The choice of Rialto as a central site was not an accident. It reflected a strategic calculation that safety, trade routes, and political coordination could all be better managed from that position. In later centuries, this area would become the heart of Venice. But the basic move already belonged to this early period. While all of this was unfolding, Venice was slowly developing the habits of a commercial society. The Lagoon communities had always traded, but the scale and structure of their exchanges changed as they grew more organized. Merchants from the islands began to appear more regularly in markets up the rivers and along the coast. They carried salt, fish, and simple manufactured goods, and brought back grain, timber, and raw materials that the islands lacked. The Doge and leading families understood that their authority depended not only on military defense, but also on keeping these trade routes open and profitable. Here, geography gave the Venetians both an advantage and a responsibility. The lagoon sat at a natural crossroads between the Po Valley, the Alpine passes, and the pathways into the eastern Mediterranean. Goods from Central Europe could be funneled through inland routes down to the sea, and merchandise from the Byzantine and Muslim worlds could move in the other direction. To make the most of this position, Venice needed a stable political structure that foreign merchants and local traders could trust. The Doge, as the recognized head of government, was expected to ensure order in the harbor and on the waterways. At the same time, the Doge's power had limits. He was not a king with hereditary rights, and his decisions were increasingly watched and influenced by councils made up of leading families. Early on, these councils were informal gatherings of influential men, but over time they became more structured. This process, which would eventually lead to the complex institutions of the later Republic, began in the centuries when Venice was still finding its place between Byzantium and the Franks. The Doge, in other words, ruled, but he did not rule alone. The international situation gave these internal debates a sense of urgency. Charlemagne's coronation as emperor in Rome at the end of the 8th century challenged Byzantine claims to be the sole Roman Empire. Now, there were two emperors, one in the east and one in the west, each with supporters who believed he was the legitimate successor of the Caesars. For the Venetians, this raised uncomfortable questions. Which emperor should they recognize? Could they afford to anger either side? Venice had economic interests in both directions, ties to Constantinople through its formal status and religious links, and ties to the Frankish world through land routes and neighboring territories. Negotiations and occasional conflicts followed. Frankish forces tried at times to project control over the northern Adriatic coast, while Byzantine officials sought to hold their remaining bridgeheads. Venice became a site where these larger tensions played out. In some episodes, there were military confrontations in the lagoon area as one side or the other tested the boundaries of influence. The Doges had to manage these crises carefully, sometimes leaning toward Constantinople, sometimes appeasing Frankish demands, but always seeking to preserve local autonomy. One key outcome of these struggles was a growing recognition on both sides that Venice had a distinct role as a kind of neutral or semi-independent zone. Over time, agreements were reached that acknowledged Venetian rights to trade and self-government. These arrangements did not turn Venice into a fully sovereign state in the modern sense, but they marked an important step. The lagoon communities were no longer seen simply as imperial administrative districts. They were treated as a partner whose cooperation was valuable and whose defection could be costly. As the political status of Venice developed, so did its identity. The people of the lagoon were still Christians loyal to the wider church, but they began to see themselves as belonging to a unique community with its own traditions and laws. Local customs in commercial matters, shipping contracts, and property rights were adapted to fit the realities of a city built on water. Over time, these practices would feed into a more formal legal system. But even at this early stage, the seeds of a distinctive civic culture were present. The dogship itself changed in response to these pressures. Early doges were often chosen from prominent families, and their authority could be personal and forceful. However, the risks of allowing any one man to become too powerful were evident. If a doge behaved like a prince, he could provoke opposition from other elites and suspicion from foreign powers. Gradually, the lagoon aristocracy moved to put checks on the office. Various forms of council, oath-taking, and shared decision-making emerged to prevent the doge from acting entirely on his own. The result was not yet the full oligarchic system of later centuries, but it was already a form of collective rule. Religion also played a role in shaping the early republic. The lagoon's bishops and monasteries were not only religious authorities, they were landholders, landlords, and cultural centers. They mediated between locals and outside powers, transmitted news and instructions from distant courts, and reinforced the sense that the lagoon was a coherent Christian community. When disputes arose about doctrine or church policy, such as those over the use of images during the iconoclastic disputes in the Byzantine world, Venetian leaders had to signal their position with care. Open defiance of Constantinople could invite political consequences, yet unthinking obedience might damage relations with Rome and the Western Church. By the time Venice entered the 10th and 11th centuries, its political foundations were already visible, but its future depended on something more concrete than titles and treaties. It depended on what filled the holds of its ships. In this era, the city began to turn its geographical position and fragile security into real economic strength. The key to this transformation was a combination of salt, shipbuilding, and control of the Adriatic Sea. Salt may seem like a modest substance for an empire to rest upon, but in the medieval world it was essential. It preserved meat and fish, supported cheese-making, and was used in many crafts. Without reliable access to salt, long-distance trade in foodstuffs was difficult, and urban life was harder to sustain. The shallow waters and mudflats around Venice were well suited for salt pans, and the lagoon communities had produced salt since late Roman times. In the 10th and 11th centuries, this activity took on a new scale and a new political meaning. Venetian authorities encouraged and organized salt production because it gave them leverage over inland markets. Merchants from the Po Valley, from Lombard and later German-controlled territories, and from other Italian cities needed salt. Venice could supply it, but not just as a raw local product. Salt became part of a larger bundle of trade goods that moved along carefully managed routes. Grain, wine, timber, and metalwork could all be linked to salt exchanges, making the lagoon city a central clearing point for the region. As trade expanded, shipbuilding followed. The lagoon had always required boats for movement, but now those boats became larger, more specialized, and more numerous. Venetian shipwrights refined the construction of galleys and transport vessels suited for both coastal and open-sea sailing. The early forms of what would later be known as the arsenal began to emerge as a focused shipbuilding district, where skilled workers and organized workshops could build and repair vessels more efficiently than scattered craftspeople. The city was learning to treat shipbuilding as a strategic industry, not just a craft. This growing maritime infrastructure allowed Venice to act beyond the lagoon itself. The Adriatic Sea, stretching from the Italian peninsula to the Balkan coast, was both opportunity and risk. Along its eastern shores lay Dalmatian and Istrian towns, such as Zara, Spalato, and Trau, as well as smaller island communities. These places were culturally and politically mixed, influenced by local Slavic groups, Latin settlers, and Byzantine officials. They were also frequent targets of piracy, especially from groups such as the Narentines, whose raids threatened merchant shipping in the central Adriatic. For Venice, piracy was not simply a nuisance. It threatened the very logic of its economic model. Merchants could not invest in long voyages if ships were routinely captured or looted. Insurance could not develop without some baseline of security, and political credibility suffered if the city could not protect its own vessels. Venetian leaders recognized that the transition from a trading community to a regional power would require a shift from purely defensive behavior to active control of sea lanes. During the rule of doges like Pietro Orseolo II, Venice began to assert itself along the Dalmatian coast. Venetian fleets sailed southward, attacking pirate bases and negotiating with coastal towns. These campaigns were not always straightforward conquests. Often, Dalmatian cities entered into arrangements that recognized Venetian protection in exchange for oaths of loyalty, trade privileges, or limited tribute. In this way, Venice extended its influence without the need for large occupying armies. The essential point was that harbors and islands along the eastern Adriatic began to look to Venice for security and commercial opportunity. The effect of this maritime activism was cumulative. Each town that accepted Venetian overlordship or cooperation added another link in a chain of safe anchorages. Ships traveling from the lagoon to more distant markets could now stop at friendly ports for repairs, supplies, and shelter from storms. Over time, the Adriatic began to resemble a managed corridor, where Venetian ships enjoyed relative safety and rival powers found it harder to operate freely. This did not go unnoticed by larger political actors. In the west, the Ottonian rulers of the German Empire, who held authority over northern Italy, were keenly aware of the economic importance of Adriatic trade. In the east, the Byzantine court still claimed historical rights in the same region. Venice found itself again between empires, but now its role was different. It was no longer merely a frontier community seeking recognition. It was emerging as the de facto maritime manager of the Adriatic. Diplomacy accompanied naval action. Treaties with German emperors, such as the arrangements traditionally associated with the reign of Emperor Otto III, confirmed Venetian commercial privileges in imperial territories and recognized its special status on the sea. Similar understandings with Byzantine officials acknowledged Venetian involvement in Dalmatian towns that had once been considered part of the imperial orbit. These documents often dealt with tariffs, legal jurisdiction over merchants, and the responsibilities of Venetian authorities to keep piracy in check. The message was clear. Venice was expected to police the sea in exchange for formal privileges. Inside the city, these external developments reinforced the power of merchant families and the importance of organized governance. Major trading houses invested in ships and cargo, often pooling resources to spread risk across several voyages. Partnerships and contracts became more complex, with investors funding expeditions in return for a share of profits rather than direct physical control of goods. This helped concentrate capital in the hands of a commercial elite, while also broadening participation in maritime ventures. An artisan or minor landholder might put some savings into a voyage, tying his fortunes indirectly to the success of Venetian trade. The Doge and the emerging councils had to manage this commercial energy. They issued regulations on shipbuilding standards, navigation rules, and harbor procedures. They mediated disputes between merchants and foreign traders, often relying on a mixture of written customs and practical judgment. The more Venice depended on trade, the more it needed predictable rules. A reputation for fairness and stability became an asset, encouraging merchants from other cities to bring their business to the Rialto markets rather than to rival ports. Rivalry was always present. Cities such as Bari, Ancona, and Ravenna sought their own share of Adriatic activity, and across the sea, the maritime republics of Amalfi and later Pisa and Genoa were building their own fleets. For now, Venice's strength lay in its close control of the northern Adriatic and its head start in organizing the Dalmatian coast. But competition in the wider Mediterranean was already taking shape. The foundations laid in the 10th and 11th centuries would determine how Venice could respond to that competition in later periods. Religion and culture intertwined with this economic and political expansion. Monasteries and churches along the Adriatic benefited from improved security and trade. Pilgrims and clerics traveled more safely between Italian and Dalmatian shores, and relics moved along the same routes as spices and cloth. Venetian sponsorship of religious institutions in Dalmatian towns was not only pious, it was also a way to cement influence and loyalty. By supporting local churches and building new ones, the Republic presented itself as a protector of Latin Christianity in a region where different traditions met. At the same time, the city's own urban fabric adapted to its growing maritime role. Wharves and quays were extended, warehouses multiplied, specialized districts developed around shipbuilding, rope-making, sail production, and metalwork for anchors and fittings. The lagoon's limited land space forced people to build upward and to use every available patch of ground efficiently. In such a crowded environment, the flow of goods and people had to be carefully regulated to avoid chaos. This encouraged a culture of minute regulation and record-keeping that would become a hallmark of Venetian administration. The social impact of this maritime growth was significant. Wealth from trade did not spread evenly, but it did create opportunities beyond the old landowning elites. Successful ship captains, brokers, and craftsmen could rise in status, marrying into established families or gaining access to political circles. Foreign communities, including Greeks, Dalmatians, and others, established themselves in quarters of the city, adding to Venice's multicultural character. The city became a place where different languages were heard on the bridges and in the markets, and where information from distant ports circulated quickly. All of this activity slowly changed how outsiders described the Adriatic. Instead of being a loosely connected stretch of water with many competing powers, it increasingly appeared as a space marked by Venetian presence. Some later writers would refer to it metaphorically as a kind of Venetian Gulf, reflecting the sense that the Republic's ships and laws dominated the sea from the head of the Adriatic down to the Dalmatian coast. This did not mean that other ships were excluded, but it did mean that they often had to navigate within a framework of Venetian expectations and enforcement. As Venice's ships ranged farther across the Adriatic and its merchants grew richer, the city faced a problem that many medieval powers did not have. It was not ruled by a conquering dynasty or a warrior aristocracy. Its strongest figures were traders and ship owners whose wealth was tied to contracts, credit, and fragile confidence. The question was how to build a government that would protect their interests, limit internal conflict, and still speak with a single voice to foreign powers. Over the course of the 11th and 12th centuries, Venice's answer was to turn itself into a republic ruled by a tightly organized merchant elite. The Doge remained the visible head of state, but around him grew a web of councils and magistrates that gradually restricted his power and embedded decision-making in a broader patrician class. This process did not happen all at once. It took a long series of small steps, legal changes, and political crises to produce the system that later observers would admire for its stability. One important change was the growing use of written law and recorded custom. In a city where trade depended on trust, people needed clear rules about who could do what, who owed what, and how disputes would be settled. Venetian leaders began to collect and standardize practices that had previously been handled informally. This included rules on inheritance, property rights along canals, obligations of ship captains and crews, and relations between citizens and foreigners. The more commerce expanded, the more detailed these regulations became. At the heart of the evolving system stood the Doge, but his position was steadily reshaped. Early doges could still act in ways that resembled princely rulers, surrounding themselves with relatives and attempting to create a family monopoly on power. When such efforts went too far, they provoked resistance from other leading families, sometimes in the form of violent uprisings or forced abdications. Out of these conflicts came a new understanding. The Doge would rule for life, but he would do so under strict conditions set by the community. These conditions were written down in a document that each new Doge had to swear to uphold, known as the Ducal Promissory Oath. Over time, this oath expanded in length and detail. It limited the Doge's ability to make private property deals, to appoint relatives to high office, or to conduct foreign policy without consultation. It required him to respect the role of councils and not to change laws on his own. In effect, every Doge began his term by publicly acknowledging that he was not above the Republic's institutions. This was a powerful signal, both inside and outside Venice, that the city valued collective rule over personal authority. The councils that surrounded the Doge grew more formal in the same period. A smaller advisory group, sometimes called the Ducal Council, sat with him daily and had to consent to many of his actions. A broader assembly, later known as the Great Council, brought together members of the leading families to deliberate on matters of law, taxation, and foreign relations. Other specialized bodies emerged, such as a council that focused on legal appeals and criminal cases, and another that helped prepare diplomatic missions. What made this council system distinctive was the way it turned merchants into magistrates. Many of the men who sat in these bodies were directly involved in trade. They owned ships, invested in voyages, or managed business houses that operated across the Mediterranean. When they debated tariffs, naval policy, or treaties, they did so with a detailed understanding of how such decisions would affect real commercial activity. This did not mean that they were always wise or fair, but it did mean that the state's choices were closely linked to the interests of those who paid for fleets and financed trade. As the councils grew more powerful, they also became more exclusive. Voting and eligibility rules slowly narrowed the circle of families who could participate. A crucial turning point came with the process later remembered as the closing of the Great Council. Under this change, Membership in the main governing assembly was no longer open to any citizen who could meet certain requirements. Instead, it became tied to hereditary patrician status. Only those whose families were already recognized in the council lists could expect to hold office in future generations. This closing was not a single event, but rather a series of legal adjustments and political maneuvers. Its effect, however, was clear. Over time, it created a stable patrician class that monopolized formal power. Within this group, there were old families with long pedigrees and newer ones that had risen through recent commercial success, but all shared a common interest in preserving their status and managing the republic as a collective enterprise. They became the permanent political class of Venice. The creation of a closed patriciate did not eliminate social mobility entirely. Wealthy non-patrician citizens, often called citizens of origin, could still play important roles in commerce, administration, and the professions. They might manage state finances, serve as notaries, or command ships. However, they did not have full access to the highest decision-making bodies. This layered social structure allowed the patricians to draw on a wide pool of talent and expertise while keeping ultimate authority in their own hands. The Duomo of St. Mark and the growing complex of buildings around the ducal palace symbolized this new order. The Doge lived and worked in the palace, but he did so in constant proximity to the council chambers. The same architectural space housed the head of state and the assemblies that limited him. This physical closeness reflected a political reality. Decisions in Venice were not made by a distant monarch issuing commands from an isolated court, but by overlapping committees of merchants and magistrates who saw each other almost daily. Because Venice's leaders were merchants, they brought a contractual mindset into politics. Agreements between the state and individuals, or between Venice and other powers, were often drafted with the precision of commercial deals. Parts of the city's legal culture resembled the structure of business partnerships. Obligations were spelled out, penalties were defined, and every party's role was recorded. This habit helped Venice maintain long-term relationships with foreign rulers and trading partners who could rely on written privileges and precedents instead of personal promises alone. The rise of a merchant oligarchy also influenced how Venice handled internal conflicts. In many medieval cities, rival factions clashed in the streets, tearing down each other's houses, seizing towers, and turning politics into a series of vendettas. Venice certainly had its share of feuds and conspiracies, but the ruling class had strong incentives to keep such violence in check. Street fighting disrupted trade, scared away foreign merchants, and risked drawing in outside powers. As a result, the councils developed procedures to investigate plots, punish would-be tyrants, and discourage private armies. One famous example from a slightly later period, the failed conspiracy of Marino Falier, shows how seriously the Republic took the threat of individual ambition. When the Doge attempted to overthrow the oligarchic system and set himself up as a kind of prince, the councils acted quickly to arrest, try, and execute him. His portrait in the ducal palace was replaced with a blank space, a lasting reminder that Venice did not tolerate attempts to place one man above the law. Even though this event belongs to a later chapter, its roots lie in the earlier centuries when the Republic first committed itself to collective rule. Another important development was the growing role of state record-keeping. Venetian officials maintained detailed archives of laws, decrees, and diplomatic letters. They recorded council decisions, financial accounts, and agreements with foreign merchants. Over time, this produced a vast written memory that future generations could consult. It gave the Republic continuity and allowed later leaders to argue from precedent. For a maritime power that depended on stable expectations, this institutional memory was a crucial asset. From the outside, Venice began to look different from other Italian cities. It did not have a powerful bishop or archbishop dominating politics. It did not fall under the direct control of an emperor or a pope. Nor did it follow the pattern of many communes on the mainland, where popular assemblies rose and fell in turbulent cycles. Instead, observers saw a city where the leading families ruled collectively through councils, where decisions were debated at length, and where even the Doge was bound by oath and law. This did not mean that everyone loved the system. Excluded families and ambitious individuals sometimes resented their lack of access to high office. Ordinary workers and sailors could feel that the patricians cared more about profits than about living conditions. Yet, compared with the frequent coups and civil wars in other cities, Venice offered a relatively predictable environment. That predictability, in turn, attracted capital and talent. Merchants from abroad who settled in the city could adapt to its rules and trust that those rules would not be overturned overnight by a palace revolution. When the crusading movement began in the late 11th century, Venice did not rush to join for purely spiritual reasons. The city watched carefully as armies of Western nobles moved eastward, and as new Latin states appeared on the map of the Eastern Mediterranean. Venetian leaders quickly understood that these changes could reshape trade routes and political alliances. If managed well, they could open unprecedented opportunities for a maritime republic whose strength lay in ships, credit, and negotiation. The first crusaders who marched toward the Eastern Mediterranean relied mainly on overland routes. They passed through territories controlled by the Byzantine Empire and then down into the Levant. For Venice, the more interesting development lay not in the initial military campaigns, but in the new pattern of demand that followed. Suddenly, large numbers of people in Western Europe wanted transport, supplies, and communication lines to connect them with the Crusader states that had been established in the Eastern Mediterranean. Moving knights, pilgrims, and goods back and forth by sea would become a major business, and Venice was well placed to provide it. Even before the Crusades, Venice had secured important privileges from the Byzantine court. Under emperors of the Comnenian dynasty, most notably Alexios I, the Venetians received extensive commercial rights in imperial ports, especially Constantinople. In exchange, Venice offered naval support in the empire's struggles against Norman and other Western enemies. This arrangement was recorded in Golden Bull decrees that granted the Republic tax reductions, warehouse rights, and its own quarter in the imperial capital. For Venice, these concessions turned Constantinople into a kind of eastern base, where its merchants could operate with strong legal protection. When Latin Crusader states appeared in the Levant, Venice used a similar logic. Instead of treating the Crusades only as holy wars, the Republic treated them as occasions to secure new commercial treaties. Venetian fleets were valuable not simply because they could carry warriors. They were valuable because they could blockade ports, disrupt enemy shipping, and bring siege equipment and supplies. Crusader rulers who needed naval support were willing to pay for it with market privileges and urban space. A clear example comes from the Venetian expedition that helped capture the city of Tyre in the early 12th century. The Doge at that time led a fleet to the Eastern Mediterranean, where it cooperated with the Kingdom of Jerusalem in operations against Fatimid-controlled ports. After the successful siege of Tyre, the Venetians negotiated a detailed agreement known as the Pact of Warmund. This treaty granted them a share of the city itself, as well as a privileged position in many towns of the kingdom. They received their own streets, markets, churches, and even mills and ovens, largely under Venetian jurisdiction rather than local courts. For ordinary Venetians, such clauses were not abstract legal phrases. They translated into real neighborhoods where Venetian law applied, where goods could be stored without extra taxes, and where judges from home would hear disputes. A merchant arriving in Tyre or Acre could step into a familiar institutional environment backed by the power of the Republic. This lowered risks and costs, making it easier to plan long-term ventures. The same expedition also illustrates how Venice used pressure as well as cooperation. On its way to and from the Levant, the fleet raided certain Byzantine islands and coastal sites, reminding the emperor that Venetian naval support could not be taken for granted. These actions helped persuade the imperial government to renew and extend the Republic's commercial privileges in Byzantine ports. In a sense, the Venetians were practicing a subtle form of maritime blackmail. They offered valuable services in crusading theaters, but they also showed that they could be troublesome if their interests were ignored. The pattern continued as later crusades unfolded. When Western rulers planned new expeditions, they often turned to Venice for transport. Organizing such sea journeys required considerable resources and coordination. Ships had to be built or refitted, crews hired, provisions stockpiled, and sailing schedules planned with some attention to winds and seasons. Venetian authorities treated these ventures as complex contracts rather than as acts of spontaneous piety. They negotiated with crusade leaders over the number of passengers, the amount of cargo, the timing of departure, and the exact forms of payment. One of the best-known cases, which would have far-reaching consequences, involved an agreement to transport a large crusading host for a fixed fee, payable partly in cash and partly in shared conquest. When fewer crusaders arrived than expected and could not pay the full agreed sum, the Venetians demanded alternative compensation in the form of military actions that suited their interests. This logic of contract enforcement, applied ruthlessly at a grand scale, would help divert a later crusade toward targets that were more profitable than pious. That story belongs to the next section, but its roots lie in this period, when Venice perfected the art of linking crusade logistics to its own strategic goals. For Venice, the Crusades were not only about the Levant, they also reshaped the Republic's position in the broader Mediterranean. Control of sea routes to the Holy Land depended in part on access to island bases and intermediate ports. Venetian merchants and diplomats worked to ensure that wherever crusaders went, Venetian interests would follow. They sought privileges in Cyprus, in coastal Syria, and in ports of the Aegean. In many places, they coexisted with other Italian maritime rivals, especially Genoa and Pisa, who were trying to secure similar advantages. This rivalry could be intense. All three cities supplied ships and sailors to crusading armies, but they also competed for quarters in the same towns, for control of harbor dues, and for influence over local rulers. Sometimes their fleets fought each other even while officially serving the same Christian cause. Yet Venice retained a special edge through its long-standing relationship with Byzantium and its organized council structure at home, which allowed it to coordinate policy across many theaters. The economic impact of crusading contracts on Venice's internal life was considerable. Large transport deals brought sudden inflows of cash, sometimes in the form of precious metals or high-value goods. At the same time, they required heavy upfront investment in shipbuilding and provisioning. To manage this, Venetian merchants and the state refined forms of public and private credit. The Republic expanded its use of long-term public debt, sold in small shares to citizens, to fund major naval undertakings. Merchants continued to rely on commenda-style partnerships, in which one party supplied capital and another traveled with the goods, sharing profits according to agreed fractions when the voyage ended. Because crusade-related traffic was irregular, it could not fully replace ordinary trade, but it did complement it. Ships carrying crusaders also carried cargo. Fleets that sailed to the Levant often returned loaded with spices, sugar, textiles, and other Eastern products. Venice did not simply serve as a ferry service for warriors. It integrated crusading logistics into an expanding commercial web that linked Alexandria, Constantinople, and Syrian ports with markets in Italy and beyond. Politically, the Republic's role in the Crusades enhanced its prestige. Popes and Western princes saw Venice as an indispensable maritime partner. Byzantine emperors, even when wary of Venetian power, recognized that the city could not easily be ignored. Rulers of the Crusader states understood that their survival often depended on regular convoys of men and supplies from Europe, which meant maintaining good relations with the Republic. All of this gave Venice considerable diplomatic weight. Its envoys could negotiate from a position of strength, claiming that they represented not only a city, but a critical link in Christian communication with the Holy Land. Yet this position was double-edged. Greater involvement in Eastern affairs also meant greater exposure to shifting alliances and resentments. Some Byzantines resented the scale of Venetian privileges in their ports, seeing them as an unwelcome intrusion into the empire's economic sovereignty. Other Italian cities accused Venice of using crusading rhetoric to disguise self-interested aggression. Even within the Latin East, tension sometimes flared between local Frankish lords and Venetian communities, especially when legal jurisdictions overlapped or when taxes were contested. Inside Venice, however, the overall effect was to reinforce the power of the merchant ruling class and to deepen the Republic's orientation toward long-distance trade. The Great Council and Senate debated crusade-related contracts with an eye to profit and risk. Decisions about whether to send fleets and under what conditions were guided by calculations about tariffs, market access, and potential competition. The idea that war and religion could be instruments of commercial policy became embedded in the political culture. At the same time, ordinary Venetians experienced the crusading era in more immediate ways. Shipbuilders found steady work outfitting fleets. Sailors and marines signed on for dangerous voyages that could bring both pay and plunder. Dock workers, artisans, and small shopkeepers felt the effects of each major expedition as the city's population swelled with foreign visitors and as goods flooded in or out of the harbor. Stories of distant battles, sieges, and miraculous events circulated in taverns and parish churches, mixing with reports of new markets and exotic products. Religious life in the city adapted as well. Crusading sermons were preached in Venice, encouraging participation and support. Relics from the Eastern Mediterranean, acquired through purchase, donation, or more dubious means, made their way into Venetian churches and monasteries. These sacred objects linked the city symbolically to the Holy Land and to the broader Christian story of pilgrimage and redemption. For many inhabitants, the Crusades were not only a commercial and political phenomenon, but also a spiritual one, even if the decisions at the top were often guided by secular considerations. When the crusade that we now call the Fourth set out from Western Europe, it was officially aimed at Egypt, a key stronghold of Muslim power. On paper, it had nothing to do with attacking Christian cities, and certainly not with overthrowing the greatest Christian capital in the East. Yet within a few years, a combination of unpaid debts, internal Byzantine struggles, and Venetian strategy turned this crusade into something entirely different. For Venice, the outcome would be the creation of a scattered but powerful maritime empire across the eastern Mediterranean. The story began with a contract. Crusade leaders turned again to Venice to provide ships and supplies for a massive expedition. The Republic agreed to build and equip a fleet large enough to carry many thousands of men and horses, to feed them for months, and to escort them across the sea. In return, the Crusaders promised a large payment, along with a share in whatever lands and plunder they might seize. Venetian shipyards and workshops worked intensively to meet their side of the bargain, investing heavily in timber, labor, and provisions. When the time came to depart, far fewer Crusaders arrived in Venice than expected. The leaders of the crusade could not pay the full sum they had promised. For the Venetian government, this was not just a disappointing business deal, it was a serious financial crisis. The state had laid out enormous resources based on the contract. Abandoning the whole project would mean absorbing a ruinous loss. At this moment, the Doge, Enrico Dandolo, and the Venetian councils sought ways to salvage both their investment and their strategic interests. The solution they offered set the crusade on a new path. Instead of demanding immediate cash, the Venetians proposed that the Crusaders help them capture the Adriatic port of Zara, whose rulers had broken away from Venetian control and placed themselves under the protection of the King of Hungary. By assisting in this attack, the Crusaders could work off part of their debt. Many of them were uneasy about turning their weapons against a Christian city, but the pressure of obligation and the leadership of Dandolo carried the day. Zara fell after a siege, and Venice reasserted its dominance there. Even before the shock of this episode had fully settled, another opportunity presented itself. Agents of a Byzantine prince, Alexios, approached the crusade leadership. Alexios was the son of a deposed emperor, Alexios III, having usurped the throne in Constantinople. The young prince and his supporters promised extraordinary rewards if the Crusaders would help restore him to power. Large payments of silver, military support for the crusade in the Holy Land, and the submission of the Byzantine Church to Rome. For leaders struggling with debt and uncertain about their next move, this offer was tempting. The details of what happened next are complex and still debated, but the broad pattern is clear. Step by step, the crusade was drawn deeper into Byzantine internal politics. The Venetians, with their long experience in imperial affairs and their strong commercial presence in Constantinople, played a central role in these negotiations. Doge Enrico Dandolo himself, despite his advanced age and near blindness, sailed with the fleet and directed operations with remarkable energy. At first, the Crusaders and Venetians presented themselves as allies of the rightful heir. They arrived before Constantinople and demanded that Alexios III restore his deposed relatives or accept the young Alexios as co-emperor. When these demands were rejected, the Allied forces attacked. After fierce fighting on land and sea, the defenders gave way and the usurper fled. The young claimant was crowned as Alexios IV, sharing the throne with his restored father. However, promises made from exile proved hard to fulfill in practice. Raising the huge sums promised to the Crusaders required heavy taxation and unpopular policies. Many citizens of Constantinople resented both the Latin forces camped outside their walls and the influence of Venice within their city. Tensions grew, and within a short time, a new coup overthrew Alexios IV. A new emperor, Alexios V, took power, rejecting the treaties with the Crusaders. At this point, the fragile alliance collapsed. The Crusade leadership, including the Venetians, decided on a drastic course. They would attack and seize Constantinople outright. In the spring of the early 13th century, after bitter assaults on the sea walls and brutal fighting in the streets, the city fell. The sack that followed was one of the most violent and destructive episodes in medieval history. Churches, palaces, and homes were looted. Treasures accumulated over centuries were carried off. Latin chroniclers themselves described the devastation with shock. For Venice, the conquest of Constantinople was not only an explosion of violence, it was also the opening of a major political and commercial opportunity. The Crusade leaders agreed to divide the lands of the Byzantine Empire among themselves, creating what would be called the Latin Empire and various dependent principalities. In a formal partition treaty, Venice was assigned a remarkable share. Instead of seeking a compact block of territory on land, Venetian negotiators focused on coastal cities, islands, and key harbors. They claimed important sites along the entrance to the Black Sea, strategic points in the Aegean, and major islands such as Crete. They also secured a significant portion of Constantinople itself, including a large quarter of the city, important churches, and control of certain gates and harbors. The Doge added to his titles the phrase, Lord of a quarter and a half of the Empire of Romania, using the medieval term for the Byzantine world. This pattern of acquisitions reveals the logic behind Venetian choices. They were not interested in becoming a traditional territorial empire with large inland provinces. Their priorities were sea routes, anchorages, and commercial hubs. Holding Crete, for example, meant having a valuable base between the Adriatic and the Levant, ideal for supplying fleets and storing goods. Control of ports in the Peloponnese, such as Modon and Coron, provided stopping points for ships traveling to and from the east. Possessions near the entrance to the Black Sea offered influence over trade from that region. To manage this new maritime empire, Venice developed flexible forms of colonial governance. In some territories, the Republic installed officials known as dukes or baili, who combined administrative, judicial, and military functions. These men were chosen from patrician families and served for fixed terms, after which they returned home to be held accountable for their conduct. Their instructions, preserved in ducal letters, laid out in detail how they were to defend the territory, deal with local elites, and protect Venetian commercial interests. In other places, Venice allowed or encouraged allied noble families to establish quasi-independent lordships, provided they recognized Venetian overlordship and granted special rights to Venetian merchants. This was particularly common in the Aegean Islands, where Latin lords carved out principalities under the loose umbrella of Venetian power. From the Republic's point of view, this arrangement reduced direct costs, while still ensuring that friendly regimes controlled key harbors. The impact on trade was immediate and profound. With a chain of bases stretching from the Adriatic to Crete and beyond, Venetian convoys could move with greater security and organization. The Republic now had the legal and military leverage to dominate access to certain routes and to impose favorable conditions in ports under its influence. Merchant rivals, especially Genoa, were keenly aware of the shift. The balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean had tilted sharply toward Venice. For the Byzantine world, the consequences were catastrophic. The old empire did not disappear entirely. Successor states such as the empires of Nicaea and Trebizond preserved Byzantine traditions and sought to reconquer Constantinople. But the unity of the Greek-speaking world under a single imperial center had been shattered. Venetian strongpoints combined with Latin lordships cut across old lines of administration and diverted revenues into foreign hands. Local populations, often Orthodox Christians, found themselves under Latin rulers whose language, customs, and religious alignment were different. These tensions fueled long-term resentment. Even when the Byzantines eventually retook Constantinople in the later 13th century, they could not simply restore the old order. Venice still held many of its island and coastal possessions, and its merchants continued to enjoy wide privileges in both Latin and Greek ports. At the same time, Genoa positioned itself as a champion and ally of the restored Byzantine regime, gaining important concessions in places such as Galata, across the Golden Horn from Constantinople. The stage was set for a prolonged rivalry between Venice and Genoa, fought not only in naval battles but also in diplomatic and commercial arenas. Within Venice, the new empire reinforced existing trends. The patrician ruling class now had far more offices to fill abroad, from governors and judges to customs inspectors and military commanders. Serving in these positions offered both honor and opportunities for profit, but it also required discipline. The councils in Venice issued many regulations aimed at preventing corruption, abuse of local populations, or private deals that might harm public interests. Officials were required to swear detailed oaths before departure and to undergo formal reviews on their return. The colonization also affected Venice's social and cultural life. Goods, people, and ideas flowed in greater volume between the city and its eastern possessions. Greek artisans, sailors, and clerics lived and worked in Venetian territories. Venetian families acquired estates on islands and in coastal regions, drawing income from agriculture and local trade as well as from shipping. Churches in Venice were decorated with spoils and relics taken from the East, visible reminders of the city's role in the conquest of Constantinople. At the same time, the Republic had to devote more attention and resources to military matters. Defending scattered strongpoints against hostile neighbors, pirates, and rival cities required a reliable fleet and effective coastal defenses. This need would accelerate the development of Venice's great naval industrial complex, the arsenal, and lead to more systematic planning of fleets and convoys. The Maritime Empire created in the wake of the Fourth Crusade thus directly pushed the city further toward becoming a highly organized naval power. By the time Venice had carved out its new positions in the eastern Mediterranean, it faced a practical question that would shape its future for centuries. How do you keep a scattered maritime empire connected and defended when your home city sits on wooden piles in a lagoon? The answer was not only strategy, but organization. Venice built a system that combined industrial-scale shipbuilding, careful state planning, and a disciplined maritime workforce. At the center of that system stood the Venetian arsenal. The arsenal was more than a shipyard. It was a vast state complex devoted to producing and maintaining the material of sea power. Within its walls, workers built hulls, forged anchors, twisted rope, cut and seasoned timber, and stored sails, oars, and weapons. The Republic did not invent shipbuilding, but it did something unusual for its time. It concentrated and coordinated the whole process under direct public control. Instead of relying mainly on private yards scattered across the city, the government turned the arsenal into a central engine for its naval strength. This concentration allowed Venice to experiment with forms of standardization that would have been hard to achieve in more fragmented systems. War galleys, in particular, were constructed to common patterns. Their length, beam, number of oars, and internal layout were defined within relatively narrow limits. This made it easier to train crews, to replace damaged parts, and to plan fleets. A sailor who had learned to work on one state galley could adapt quickly to another. A shipwright familiar with the structure of one hull could repair many others. Standardization also made it possible to prepare fleets in advance of crisis. The arsenal stored prefabricated components including planks, ribs, masts, and rigging. In times of peace, workers did not simply sit idle. They used the breathing space to produce and stockpile what might be needed later. When the Senate decided to raise a fleet, the arsenal could assemble ships far more quickly than if it had to start from raw timber each time. Some later observers compared this to an early assembly line, where materials moved from one specialized group of workers to another in sequence. The workers in the arsenal formed a distinct community within Venetian society. Many were skilled artisans, whose families had been employed there for generations. Others were unskilled laborers who handled heavy lifting and simple tasks. The Republic paid them wages rather than relying purely on forced labor. This did not mean that conditions were easy, but it did mean that the arsenal functioned as an important source of employment and technical expertise. The state kept careful records of who worked there, what they did, and how much they were paid, reflecting the bureaucratic culture that underpinned Venetian power. Control over the arsenal was firmly in the hands of the government. Magistrates known as supervisors of the arsenal oversaw its operations, reporting to the Senate and other councils. They were responsible for ensuring that supplies were purchased, that tools and stores were maintained, and that workers did not steal materials or slow production. Their instructions often went into meticulous detail, demonstrating how seriously the Republic took the management of its naval infrastructure. The ships themselves reflected the dual character of Venice as both a military and commercial power. The classic war galley was long, relatively narrow, and propelled mainly by oars with a sail for favorable winds. It carried fighting men, archers, and sometimes small siege engines. Its purpose was to move quickly, ram or board enemy vessels, and support coastal operations. Alongside these warships, Venice also built rounder, more capacious sailing vessels suited for trade. Some ships could serve both roles, carrying cargo in peaceful times and soldiers when needed. To coordinate the use of these ships, Venice developed a convoy system known as the Mudi. The state organized regular sailing cycles that linked the home port with key destinations such as Constantinople, Alexandria, and the ports of the Western Mediterranean. Each convoy included a group of armed vessels, often under the command of a noble captain appointed by the government. Private merchants could book space on these convoys, loading their goods under the protection of the armed escort and within a framework of public regulations. This system served several purposes at once. It reduced the risks of piracy and sudden attack, since ships traveled in company rather than alone. It allowed the government to collect information and impose standards, because convoy captains had to report on conditions in the ports they visited and on the behavior of those under their authority. It also gave Venice leverage in foreign markets, since the arrival of a convoy meant the sudden appearance of a large volume of goods and credit, which local authorities could not ignore. Convoys were not the only way Venetians traveled, but they formed the backbone of long-distance maritime policy. The combination of a centralized arsenal and organized MUD gave the Republic a remarkable capacity to plan its maritime activity. Councils in Venice could decide, months or years in advance, how many ships to send on which routes, what kinds of cargo they should prioritize, and how much naval force should accompany them. This level of state involvement in commerce was unusual and reflected the close intertwining of public and private interests in the oligarchic republic. The relationship between state and merchants was not always smooth. Wealthy trading families sometimes resented restrictions on where and when they could sail. They might prefer to send their own vessels independently, seeking quicker profits or secret deals. The government, however, argued that discipline was necessary for the safety and reputation of all. Debates over licensing of ships, allocation of convoy space, and the level of required armament echoed through the council chambers. In these debates, the long-term logic of collective security often prevailed, even if individual merchants grumbled. Beyond trade, the arsenal and its fleets allowed Venice to think differently about war. When a conflict broke out in the Eastern Mediterranean or along the Adriatic, the Republic did not need to rely solely on hastily assembled private vessels. It could call on a corps of state-owned galleys, crewed by experienced mariners and soldiers. These forces could be expanded by requisitioning or hiring additional ships from private owners. But the existence of a standing naval capacity gave Venice a strategic advantage over many rivals. Naval officers and marines formed another specialized group within the Republic. Commanders were usually drawn from patrician families and appointed for limited terms. They were expected to combine courage with political reliability, since they represented the Republic abroad. Their instructions often included not only military objectives, but also detailed guidance on how to treat allies, subjects, and neutral powers. Marine infantry, recruited from the citizen population and from subject territories, trained for boarding actions and coastal assaults. Their presence on galleys gave Venice the ability to land forces quickly in support of diplomatic or commercial aims. The logistical demands of maintaining fleets shaped Venetian finance. Outfitting even a modest squadron required large sums for timber, rope, food, pay, and weaponry. The Republic relied on its system of public debt, known as the funded loan, to spread these costs over time and across many investors. Citizens who bought shares in the public debt received regular interest payments funded by taxes and customs duties. In this way, a significant part of the population had a direct stake in the continued success of Venetian maritime power. If the fleets did well, trade flourished, and the state could meet its obligations. Technically, Venetian shipbuilders remained receptive to innovations. They paid attention to developments in hull design, rigging, and navigation that came from other Mediterranean traditions. Contacts with Arab and Byzantine seafaring cultures brought knowledge of instruments and methods that could be adapted to local needs. At the same time, the Republic was cautious about radical change that might disrupt tried and tested systems. It tended to refine existing designs rather than gamble on unproven models, a reflection of its broader political culture. The physical setting of the arsenal reinforced its strategic importance. Enclosed within high walls and guarded gates, it occupied a large section of the city's eastern edge. Access was restricted, and sensitive areas were off-limits to foreigners. From the water, the arsenal had its own basin, allowing ships to enter and leave without passing through the main commercial harbor. This separation underscored the distinction between ordinary mercantile activity and the core machinery of state power. The arsenal also had symbolic weight. Foreign visitors who were allowed to see it came away impressed by the scale and order of the place. For them, it illustrated the difference between Venice and other cities where shipbuilding was scattered and less organized. At civic ceremonies, references to the arsenal and the fleet often accompanied praise for the city's liberty and stability. In Venetian self-understanding, sea power was not an accident of geography alone. It was the result of disciplined collective effort. As Venice tightened its grip on the eastern Mediterranean after the conquest of Byzantine territories, it discovered that its greatest enemy was not a sultan, an emperor, or a king. It was another republic built on ships and trade contracts, a city that thought about the sea in strikingly similar ways. That rival was Genoa. Over the course of the 13th and 14th centuries, Venice and Genoa fought a series of wars that turned the Mediterranean into a battlefield of convoys and galleys. The outcome of this struggle would determine who controlled the main arteries of long-distance commerce between Europe and the eastern markets. Genoa, like Venice, was a maritime city with limited farmland and a strong merchant class. Its harbor, facing the Ligurian Sea, opened onto routes toward Iberia, North Africa, and the Western Mediterranean. Genoese merchants had established themselves in trading centers from the Black Sea to the Atlantic, and their bankers financed rulers across Europe. In many ways, Genoa was Venice's mirror image on the opposite side of the peninsula, a community of ship owners and investors who viewed the sea as both workplace and battlefield. The rivalry between the two cities sharpened as both sought privileged positions in the same places. In Constantinople, Genoa gained a major foothold in the district of Galata, directly across from the older Venetian quarter. Along the routes to the Black Sea, Genoese colonies such as Caffa challenged Venetian influence. In the Levant, Genoese communities competed with Venetians for control over piers, warehouses, and customs points. The same pattern repeated itself in ports around the Mediterranean, where local rulers played the two republics against each other in search of better deals. Conflicts at sea often began with disputes that seemed, at first, limited in scope. A clash between convoys, the seizure of a ship, or a quarrel over tariffs in some distant harbor could escalate into open war. Both republics were proud and sensitive to perceived slights. Their merchants demanded protection, and their governments struggled to maintain prestige in the eyes of allies and subjects. Once tensions rose, it did not take much to turn commercial rivalry into military confrontation. The first major phase of open warfare between Venice and Genoa in the later 13th century saw battles fought from the eastern Mediterranean to the Ligurian and Adriatic seas. Venetian fleets, built and maintained through the arsenal, faced Genoese squadrons manned by experienced sailors who had cut their teeth on long voyages. Both sides used similar ship types, mainly galleys, and similar tactics, emphasizing maneuver, ramming, and boarding. The skill of individual captains and the discipline of oarsmen and marines often made the difference. One of the most famous early clashes was the battle off Curzola in the southern Adriatic. A large Venetian fleet met a Genoese force in a confrontation that ended disastrously for Venice. Many Venetian ships were captured or destroyed. Among the prisoners, according to later tradition, was Marco Polo, who would supposedly dictate his travel account while in Genoese captivity. Whether or not every detail of that story is precise, the broader point is clear. Curzola was a shock that reminded Venice its supremacy at sea could be challenged. The defeat forced the Republic to confront weaknesses in command and coordination. In Venice, councils debated how the disaster had occurred. Criticism fell on certain admirals, while others who had distinguished themselves in battle were praised. The state responded by tightening rules for naval command, clarifying chains of authority, and reinforcing training and discipline among crews. The arsenal increased its efforts to replace lost ships, demonstrating the city's capacity to absorb even serious blows through organized production. Genoa, for its part, drew confidence from the victory, but it also faced internal strains. The city's politics were often turbulent, with factions aligned to great families and to outside powers such as the French crown or the Holy Roman emperors. Periods of civil conflict weakened the coherence of Genoese policy and sometimes limited its ability to take full advantage of victories over Venice. This instability contrasted with Venice's more controlled oligarchic system, where internal rivalries were channeled through councils rather than street warfare. The struggle between the two republics was not confined to fleet engagements. It also took place through diplomacy and alliance building. In the eastern Mediterranean, Genoa aligned itself increasingly with the restored Byzantine Empire after the recapture of Constantinople from the Latin rulers. In return, Genoese merchants received favorable terms in Black Sea trade and in the capital's markets. Venice, deprived of some of its earlier privileges, fought back by strengthening its own network of island colonies and seeking allies among Latin powers and local rulers who distrusted Byzantine and Genoese influence. In the western Mediterranean, similar patterns emerged. Genoa fostered ties with the Aragonese crown and other powers who could help check Venetian extension into certain markets. Venice, though more focused eastward, maintained contacts and agreements that allowed it to operate in Iberian and North African ports when profitable. The two republics constantly tested each other's reach, sometimes through open war and sometimes through commercial competition under an uneasy peace. The most perilous chapter for Venice came in the 14th century with the conflict that culminated in the War of Chioggia. By this time, Genoa had recovered from earlier setbacks and was determined to break Venetian power decisively. The Genoese leadership conceived an audacious plan. Instead of merely fighting Venetian fleets in distant waters, they would carry the war directly into the Venetian Lagoon. To set this in motion, Genoa built a strong fleet and sought allies among powers hostile to Venice, including the King of Hungary and certain local lords along the Adriatic. Together, these forces hoped to cut off Venetian access to the sea and starve the city into submission. The plan relied on speed and surprise. If Genoese ships could penetrate the lagoon and establish control over strategic points, they might force the Republic to accept humiliating terms or even dismantle its maritime system. The execution came dangerously close to success. Genoese forces entered the lagoon and occupied Chioggia, a small but crucial town that controlled part of the approach to Venice. From this position, they threatened to choke off movement and supply. Within Venice, panic was real. Citizens feared that the arsenal, the heart of their naval power, might soon be under enemy fire. Some voices within the ruling class whispered about negotiation at any cost. Two figures emerged as symbols of resistance: Vetter Pisani, a seasoned admiral, and Carlo Zeno, a commander whose return with reinforcements would prove decisive. Pisani, who had earlier suffered defeat and imprisonment, was recalled and entrusted with the defense of the lagoon. He and other leaders organized a determined effort to bottle up the Genoese within Chioggia and prevent them from advancing further. Chains and defensive works were placed across channels, and remaining ships were positioned to control key waterways. The struggle that followed was not a single dramatic battle, but a grinding siege at sea. Venetian forces worked to cut off Genoese resupply lines, while the enemy tried to break out and reach open water. Within Chioggia, conditions deteriorated as food and fresh water ran low. Outside, Venetian morale rose when Carlo Zeno finally arrived with additional ships and men, tipping the balance. Together, Pisani and Zeno tightened the noose until the Genoese position collapsed. The enemy fleet was captured or destroyed, and the immediate threat to the city was removed. The victory at Chioggia saved Venice from potential ruin, but it came at enormous cost. The war had strained finances, exhausted sailors and soldiers, and disrupted trade. Many ships had been lost, and the city's resources were heavily mortgaged to fund the conflict. Yet the outcome also strengthened the determination of the patrician class to preserve and refine the systems that had allowed the Republic to survive such a close call. In the aftermath, Venice undertook a series of internal reforms and adjustments. The arsenal's capacity was further expanded and its procedures refined to ensure that fleets could be built and repaired even more quickly in future crises. Financial mechanisms, including public debt instruments, were reorganized to spread wartime costs more effectively and to maintain investor confidence. Naval regulations were updated based on hard lessons learned in combat and siege. Diplomatically, Venice sought a settlement that would prevent Genoa from mounting a similar challenge soon. Treaties concluded after the war limited Genoese presence in certain strategic zones and recognized spheres of influence. While Genoa remained a formidable rival, its failure at Chioggia had weakened its ability to project power deep into the Adriatic. Internal divisions within Genoa, combined with the financial and human losses of the war, further reduced its capacity for sustained confrontation. For ordinary Venetians, the memory of the Chioggia crisis lingered as a reminder of how fragile their maritime empire could be. Stories circulated of narrow escapes, of nights spent preparing defenses, of families watching enemy sails from the lagoon's edge. At the same time, there was pride in the collective response. Patricians, citizens, and workers in the arsenal had all contributed to the city's survival. The narrative that emerged emphasized not heroic individuals alone, but the resilience of the Republic's institutions and the effectiveness of its organized sea power. By the later 14th and early 15th centuries, Venice stood as the foremost naval power in the Adriatic and a central player in the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet beneath this success lay a vulnerability that worried the city's leaders. Venice still depended heavily on others for basic necessities, above all grain, timber, and livestock. Its wealth floated on ships, but its food and much of its raw material came from lands controlled by neighbors who might become rivals. To reduce this dependence and secure a stronger base, the Republic turned its attention inland. This move toward the mainland, the Terraferma, marked a new phase in Venetian history, reshaping the balance between sea and land in the life of the Republic. Several pressures pushed Venice in this direction. One was simple security. The city had survived the terrifying crisis of Chioggia when an enemy fleet penetrated the lagoon approaches. That experience reinforced a lesson the patricians already suspected. Maritime walls were not enough. If hostile powers controlled the rivers and towns of the nearby mainland, they could threaten Venice from short range, cut off supplies, and exploit internal unrest. A wider belt of territory under reliable control would give the city depth and breathing space. Another factor was economic. As populations grew and trade expanded, Venice's need for grain increased. Venetian merchants had long purchased cereals from a variety of suppliers, including Apulia, Sicily, and the Balkans. But the closest and potentially most reliable sources lay just beyond the lagoon, in the fertile plains of the Po Valley and surrounding regions. If Venice could secure these lands politically, it would no longer be as vulnerable to foreign embargoes or price manipulation. The Terraferma promised not only food, but also taxable wealth, tolls from roads and rivers, and access to inland markets. The mainland in question was not an empty frontier. It consisted of well-established cities and territories, many of them rich and proud, such as Padua, Vicenza, Verona, and later Brescia and Bergamo. These communities had their own histories of communal government, local aristocracies, and shifting alliances. For much of the late medieval period, they had been caught in the struggles between larger powers, especially the Visconti lords of Milan and other regional dynasties. Venice's entry into this world would change the political map of northern Italy. The process began cautiously. At first, Venice sought influence rather than outright annexation. The Republic signed treaties, offered loans, and supported friendly factions within key cities. The goal was to prevent a single hostile power, above all Milan, from surrounding the lagoon with client regimes. Venetian envoys worked to keep corridors open to the Alps and to the central Italian routes, sometimes backing local rulers, sometimes favoring communal movements that promised autonomy from overbearing lords. As Milan, under ambitious rulers, aimed to extend its control toward the eastern plains and the Adriatic, Venetian caution turned into active intervention. When a mainland city felt threatened by Milanese expansion, its leaders might appeal to Venice for protection, offering allegiance in return. In some cases, the transition was almost contractual. Venice accepted sovereignty, promised defense and good governance, and in return gained the right to station troops, appoint governors, and collect taxes. Padua was one of the key turning points. This old university city, with a strong intellectual and commercial tradition, lay close to the lagoon and controlled important routes. After a period of domination by local lords and outside powers, Padua eventually came under Venetian rule. The Republic moved from influence to direct control, integrating the city into its growing mainland dominion. Verona, with its strategic position on the road to the Alps and Germany, followed. Bit by bit, a chain of territories took shape along the northern edge of the Venetian lagoon, stretching westward. Venice's approach to governing these acquisitions revealed both continuity and innovation. The Republic did not simply impose a military occupation. It transplanted elements of its own political style onto the terraferma while respecting local customs when convenient. In each major city, Venice appointed a governor, often called a podesta or captain, drawn from the patrician class. These officials served for limited terms and were forbidden to build personal power bases. Their task was to represent Venetian authority, oversee justice, and coordinate defense. At the same time, local councils and elites retained certain roles in municipal administration. Venice understood that cooperation, not raw coercion, was more efficient in the long run. It confirmed many urban privileges, allowed local statutes to remain in force where they did not conflict with higher policy, and worked through existing institutions when possible. The goal was to stabilize the region under a broadly accepted framework while ensuring that key levers of power, defense, foreign policy, and major taxation remained firmly in Venetian hands. Military realities shaped this arrangement. Unlike its naval power, where the Republic relied on its own arsenal and citizen crews, on land, Venice often depended on professional soldiers known as Condottieri. These were mercenary captains who signed contracts to provide troops for specified periods. Famous condottieri from across Italy served Venetian interests at different times, leading armies against Milanese forces or other enemies. Their services were expensive and sometimes unreliable, but they allowed Venice to project land power without creating a permanent mass army that might threaten domestic stability. The wars of the 15th century between Venice and Milan, particularly under the Visconti and later Sforza dynasties, were complex and shifting. Campaigns along the Adige and Mincio rivers, sieges of fortified towns, and maneuvers around mountain passes all formed part of the struggle. For Venice, success on the Terraferma did not mean marching on Milan's capital, but rather securing a defensible frontier, especially along the line of the Alps and key river crossings. Control of cities like Brescia and Bergamo strengthened this position and extended the Republic's reach into the uplands. The expansion into the mainland had significant social and economic consequences for Venice itself. Patrician families who had previously focused mainly on maritime trade now saw opportunities in the purchase and management of rural estates. Landed wealth, in the form of villas and farms on the Terraferma, became an important complement to overseas investments. Venetian nobles turned themselves into landlords, exporting grain and other agricultural products from their estates to the city and abroad. This change gave the ruling class an additional stake in the stability of the mainland. At the same time, the Republic imposed a carefully managed grain policy known as the Annona system, aimed at securing supplies for the urban population. Officials monitored harvests, controlled exports in times of scarcity, and used state purchases to even out fluctuations in price. The ability to draw on mainland grain helped Venice weather bad years that might otherwise have led to famine. It also gave the state a tool to manage social tensions in the capital, since the cost and availability of bread deeply affected ordinary people. Urban life on the Terraferma changed under Venetian rule. In some cities, the end of frequent regime changes brought a measure of peace, allowing economic life to recover and crafts and trade to flourish. Venetian merchants integrated these cities into wider commercial networks, using them as staging points for goods moving between Central Europe and the Mediterranean. New roads and improved river navigation reflected the Republic's interest in facilitating movement of goods and troops. Art, architecture, and culture also felt the influence of the Lagoon capital, as Venetian styles and patronage spread inland. Despite these benefits, not everyone welcomed Venetian domination. Some local families resented the loss of political autonomy and felt subordinated to foreign overlords. Periodic revolts occurred, especially during times of war or heavy taxation. Venice responded with a mixture of repression and compromise, punishing leaders of uprisings while restoring a degree of normalcy for the broader population. The councils in Venice treated the Terraferma not as a collection of conquered lands to be plundered, but as a crucial part of the Republic's long-term structure, which had to be managed prudently. The mainland turn also altered the Republic's strategic outlook. Venetian statesmen now had to think in two directions at once. They could not ignore the sea, where their fleets still guarded routes to the Levant, Cyprus, and the Aegean. But they also had to consider the politics of Italian alliances and the balance among powers like Milan, Florence, the Papal States, and later the expanding monarchies beyond the Alps. Venice became both a maritime and a continental player, participating in peace congresses, leagues, and shifting coalitions that defined late medieval and early Renaissance Italian politics. This position at the intersection of sea and land made the Republic both stronger and more exposed. Stronger because it now had access to resources that could support its fleets and citizens in times of crisis. more exposed because it was entangled in the ambitions of powerful neighbors who no longer saw Venice only as a distant seaborne trader, but as a landholding state whose territories could be coveted or contested. The city of the Lagoon had, in a sense, stepped fully onto the Italian chessboard. Culturally, the combination of maritime wealth and mainland resources encouraged a remarkable flowering. The 15th century saw Venice evolve into one of the great centers of the Renaissance, with painters, architects, and humanists supported by patrons whose fortunes rested on both trade and land. The terraferma cities contributed their own traditions of art and scholarship, blending with the distinct atmosphere of the Lagoon capital. This cultural blossoming, while not the focus of a strictly maritime history, nonetheless formed part of the broader context in which Venetian power was exercised. From the perspective of the Maritime Empire, the mainland expansion fulfilled several goals. It provided grain and timber that could support the fleet. It offered safe staging areas for recruits and supplies bound for distant bases. It gave the Republic another domain whose revenues could help fund convoys, garrisons, and diplomatic missions. In effect, the terraferma became the solid backing behind the mobile network of islands and ports that defined Venice's overseas presence. Yet the turn toward land also introduced new tensions that would emerge more clearly in later centuries. Some critics argued that too much attention to the mainland risked distracting Venice from its true strength at sea. Others worried that land wars against powerful Italian neighbors would drain resources that might be better used in defending colonial possessions or trade routes. The leadership of the Republic had to navigate these competing priorities, trying to maintain the delicate balance that had made Venice successful. By the middle of the later medieval and early Renaissance centuries, Venice stood at the height of its maritime power. The Republic had secured a band of mainland territories, held a chain of ports and islands across the eastern Mediterranean, and maintained a disciplined naval system centered on the arsenal. All of this supported something even more remarkable: a trade network that linked the cloth halls of northern Europe with the spice markets of the Levant and the great entrepôts of the eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea. To grasp this zenith, it helps to imagine a map drawn not with borders, but with routes. From the Lagoon, lines run north and west, across the Adriatic, around the Italian peninsula, and into the Tyrrhenian Sea, then further to Provence, Catalonia, and the Low Countries. Other lines fan out south and east, toward Corfu, Crete, Cyprus, Constantinople, the ports of Syria and Palestine, and the Egyptian coast. Branching from Constantinople, routes curve into the Black Sea, touching Crimean ports and other harbors that connect to the river systems of Eastern Europe and beyond. Venice did not own all these places. What it possessed was something subtler, a combination of colonies, trading privileges, and long experience that allowed its merchants to operate in many different political environments with relative security. In some key locations, such as Crete and coastal strongholds in Greece, Venetian authority was direct and territorial. In others, like Alexandria or northern European ports, it rested on treaties and local alliances that recognized Venetian rights to maintain fondaci or trading houses. A Venetian merchant setting out from the Lagoon at this time could participate in several overlapping circuits. One important route ran northward. Ships sailed around the Italian coast and into the Ligurian and then Tyrrhenian seas, past the straits, and headed toward the western Mediterranean and beyond. Eventually, some reached the Low Countries, calling it Bruges or later Antwerp. These northern cities were major centers for the production and distribution of woolen cloth and other textiles. Flemish and English fabrics, along with metals and certain dyes, flowed southward, while spices, silk, sugar, and luxury Eastern goods moved northward in exchange. Another major route ran east and south. Convoys organized by the Venetian state, the Mude, connected the Lagoon with Constantinople, the Levant, and Egypt. A typical Eastern convoy might leave Venice with a mixture of goods: high-quality woolen cloth from Northern Europe, glassware, metal products, worked leather, and sometimes even enslaved persons obtained through various intermediaries. In return, the ships aimed to bring back pepper, cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, and other spices, along with cotton, silk, dyes such as indigo, sugar, and precious stones. Egypt, and particularly Alexandria, was crucial in this system. Spices arriving from the Indian Ocean world flowed through Red Sea and Nile routes to reach Mediterranean ports under the control of Muslim rulers. Venetian merchants, thanks to carefully negotiated agreements, were allowed to maintain their own quarter in Alexandria, where they stored goods, settled disputes in their own courts, and coordinated onward shipments. They paid customs duties and accepted restrictions imposed by local authorities, but they gained reliable access to products that were highly prized in European markets. Further north, in the Levantine ports like Beirut and Damascus's outlets, Venetian and other Italian merchants tapped into trade coming from Inner Asia and the eastern Mediterranean hinterlands. Silk from Persia, carpets, and metalware followed well-established caravan routes, ending up in coastal warehouses where Venetians bargained with local brokers. Contracts drawn up in these places could be complex, involving credit advances, futures on expected caravans, and agreements to share risk on dangerous journeys. Constantinople remained a central pivot. Even after the Byzantine Restoration, when Venetian privileges were somewhat reduced and Genoa gained influence in Galata, Venetian merchants still operated in the city, moving goods between the Black Sea and Mediterranean worlds. From Crimean ports such as Tanna and Kaffa, they obtained grain, furs, wax, timber, and, tragically, enslaved people taken from Eastern European regions. These commodities could then be moved through Constantinople to Venice and onward to Italian and Western markets. This vast movement of goods required matching innovations in finance and organization. Venetian merchants rarely traveled with large sacks of coin. Instead, they relied on instruments such as bills of exchange, which allowed them to transfer funds on paper through networks of correspondence. A merchant could deposit money with a banker in Venice and receive a written order payable in a distant city, reducing the risks of theft and making long-distance transactions more efficient. Public finance was equally sophisticated. The Republic's system of funded public debt allowed it to raise large sums for fleets and fortifications without relying solely on extraordinary taxes. Citizens bought shares in this debt, known as public loans, and received regular interest payments. These payments were funded by customs duties, harbor fees, and taxes from both the city and the mainland territories. In this way, the fortunes of many Venetian families were tied directly to the health of state finances and, indirectly, to the success of the maritime trade that kept those finances flowing. Insurance also developed as an important tool. Merchants and shipowners could purchase contracts that compensated them in the event of shipwreck, piracy, or loss of cargo. These agreements spread risk among groups of investors and made it possible to undertake ventures that would otherwise be too dangerous. Venetian notaries drafted these documents with care, specifying routes, seasons, types of goods, and the exact conditions under which payouts would occur. The language of these contracts shows how deeply the logic of risk management had penetrated commercial culture. At home, the city itself reflected the scale and diversity of its trading system. Along the Grand Canal and in the dense network of smaller waterways, warehouses, workshops, and palaces stood side by side. In certain districts, foreign communities clustered around their own churches and fondaci. German merchants, for example, had a large and important trading house where they stored metals, furs, and other goods brought over the Alps. They lived under their own rules in some respects, but were subject to Venetian oversight and taxation. The Rialto area functioned as the beating heart of commercial life. Here, brokers met in loggias to negotiate deals, exchange information, and settle disputes. Currency changers handled coins from dozens of regions, adjusting for fluctuating relative values. A visitor would have heard a mixture of languages, various Italian dialects, German, Slavic tongues, Greek, and Arabic, among others. This constant contact with different cultures did not make Venice a modern multicultural democracy, but it did make it a cosmopolitan hub where practical cooperation across boundaries was common. Socially, the wealth generated by this trade supported a stratified yet dynamic urban society. Patricians at the top invested in overseas ventures, mainland estates, and urban palaces. Beneath them, a substantial class of non-patrician citizens worked as ship captains, senior clerks, notaries, and skilled artisans. Many of these men had real chances to prosper, even if they could not enter the Great Council. Below them stood a large population of manual laborers, sailors, porters, and domestic servants, whose livelihoods depended on the smooth functioning of the maritime economy. The prosperity of the period supported cultural achievements that would make Venice famous in later memory. Painters received commissions to decorate churches and palaces that had been enriched by trade. Architects designed new facades and public buildings, funded by families whose fortunes were tied to pepper, silk, and grain. Printers and publishers took advantage of the city's wide contacts and literate population to produce and distribute books, including works of classical scholarship and practical manuals. All of this cultural activity was, in one way or another, facilitated by the financial surplus created by the trade web. Yet Venetian leaders never forgot how fragile this prosperity could be. The same routes that brought wealth also exposed the city to disease, especially plague. Ships arriving from the east could carry not only spices and textiles, but also pathogens. In response, Venice developed early forms of quarantine, building isolation stations on nearby islands where crews and passengers had to wait before entering the city. Health magistrates monitored reports of outbreaks abroad and enforced regulations designed to protect the population, even at the cost of short-term commercial losses. Another source of tension lay in the Republic's relationships with foreign powers, whose cooperation was essential for maintaining access to key markets. In Egypt and the Levant, changing dynasties, shifting alliances, and religious tensions could lead to the sudden closure of ports or the expulsion of Christian merchants. Venetian diplomats and consuls worked constantly to maintain good relations, offering gifts, adjusting to new regulations, and sometimes acting as intermediaries between Muslim rulers and Western princes. The Republic's willingness to trade with Muslim states, even when preaching in Europe emphasized religious division, reflected its pragmatic approach to commerce. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, competition from other trading cities and changing political conditions posed their own challenges. The rise of strong territorial monarchies in France, England, and the Low Countries altered the balance between cities and rulers. Tariffs, trade embargoes, and wars between northern powers could disrupt the flow of cloth and other products southward. Venetian merchants had to adjust their strategies, sometimes shifting operations from one northern port to another or relying more heavily on intermediaries. Despite these risks, the overall picture during this high point remained one of remarkable integration. Grain from the Terraferma, wool from Flanders and England, spices from the Indian Ocean, and furs from Eastern Europe all moved through circuits that touched Venetian ships, warehouses, or counting houses. Few other cities in Europe managed to sit so comfortably at the intersection of so many different economic worlds. While Venice was weaving its web of trade from Flanders to the Black Sea, a new power was steadily advancing across the eastern Mediterranean world. The Ottoman state, which began as one of several Anatolian principalities, expanded with remarkable speed. It absorbed Byzantine lands, pushed deep into the Balkans, and built a military machine that combined disciplined infantry, cavalry, and, increasingly, a substantial fleet. For Venice, this was not simply another rival city. It was a vast land empire with growing naval strength, sitting astride many of the routes on which the Venetian maritime system depended. At first, Venetian and Ottoman interests did not collide directly. In the early stages, Venetian merchants continued to trade in ports that shifted from Byzantine to Ottoman hands, adapting to new rulers but keeping their commercial routines as intact as possible. The Republic's diplomats followed their usual strategy: seek treaties, secure capitulations, and protect privileges, regardless of who held the fortress above the harbor. As long as the new authorities were willing to tax rather than expel foreign traders, Venice could tolerate changes on land. That balance began to change as the Ottomans moved steadily toward the great prize of Constantinople. For centuries, Venice had relied on the old imperial capital as a central hub. Even after the Latin conquest and later Byzantine restoration, Venetian merchants had maintained a powerful presence there. The city's commanding position between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea made it indispensable for the flow of grain, furs, wax, and other goods coming from Eastern Europe and beyond. When the Ottomans besieged Constantinople in the middle of the 15th century, Venice watched with growing concern. The Republic had interests to protect in the city, but it also had to weigh the risks of direct confrontation with the rising power. Some Venetian ships and volunteers did participate in the defense, but there was no large-scale intervention. When the city finally fell to Sultan Mehmed II, the geopolitical landscape of the region changed forever. The Byzantine Empire, long weakened, now ceased to exist as a major political actor. In its place stood an Ottoman capital that commanded both shores of the Bosporus. For Venice, the fall of Constantinople was a severe strategic blow and a diplomatic test. On the one hand, the Republic lost an old partner and saw many of its properties damaged or confiscated in the chaos of conquest. On the other hand, the Ottomans were now the gatekeepers of the Black Sea and the eastern routes. If Venice broke relations with them entirely, it would risk losing access to essential trade. The councils in the ducal palace, after heated debates, chose a pragmatic course. They recognized the new reality and sought an understanding with the Sultan. Treaties were negotiated that allowed Venetian merchants to resume activity under Ottoman sovereignty, usually in exchange for taxes and acceptance of new regulations. Consuls and resident agents worked to mediate disputes and keep commerce flowing. Yet beneath this practical cooperation, tensions simmered. The Ottomans viewed Venice as a useful but potentially troublesome presence in their waters. Venetian leaders, for their part, understood that the Republic's colonial possessions in Greece, the Aegean, and the eastern Adriatic were now exposed to a powerful and ambitious neighbor. In the decades that followed, a pattern emerged: alternating periods of uneasy peace and bitter war. Conflicts often arose from localized clashes, disputes over tribute, or raids by corsairs who blurred the line between piracy and state-sponsored warfare. When such sparks met broader strategic rivalries, full-scale campaigns erupted. The first significant Venetian-Ottoman War after the fall of Constantinople centered on control of positions in the Aegean and along the Greek coast. Venetian strongholds, such as Negroponte on the island of Euboea, came under direct attack. Negroponte held special importance. It guarded the passage between the northern and southern Aegean and had long served as a key link in Venice's chain of maritime bases. When the Ottomans besieged and eventually captured the city, the loss reverberated through Venetian politics. It demonstrated that fortresses long regarded as secure outposts could be isolated and overwhelmed by Ottoman land and sea power acting in coordination. The Republic responded by reinforcing other positions, revising defensive plans, and attempting to strengthen fleets and garrisons, but it could not reverse every defeat. Further south, ports such as Modon and Coron in the Peloponnese came into play. These harbors controlled routes around the southern tip of Greece and were vital stops for convoys traveling to and from the Levant and Egypt. The Ottomans understood their value and targeted them in subsequent conflicts. Over time, despite determined resistance, Venice lost several of these bases. Each fall narrowed the Republic's options and forced it to reroute shipping or concentrate protection on fewer, more heavily fortified points. These wars were costly in both blood and treasure. Venetian fleets had to be assembled repeatedly for large campaigns, drawing on the full capacity of the arsenal. Mainland territories and colonial possessions were taxed to pay for provisioning and wages. Casualties among sailors, marines, and soldiers mounted, and many ships were sunk or captured. Yet the Republic could not simply withdraw from the Eastern Mediterranean without abandoning core elements of its identity and economic system. The conflict with the Ottomans was not about prestige alone. It reached into the heart of Venice's Maritime Empire. Diplomacy ran alongside warfare. Venetian envoys to the Ottoman court worked skillfully to limit damage, conclude truces, and renegotiate trading rights even after defeats. The sultans, for their part, often saw value in maintaining a controlled presence of Venetian merchants in their ports. These foreigners brought silver, textiles, and other goods that could be taxed and that connected Ottoman domains with distant markets. As long as Venice did not align openly with hostile Christian coalitions, the sultans could balance military pressure with economic cooperation. At times, however, broader religious and political factors pushed the two powers into sharper opposition. Crusading rhetoric did not disappear after the earlier expeditions. It reappeared whenever European rulers considered joint action against the Ottomans. Popes called for leagues to defend Christendom, and Venice, as a maritime expert, was often invited to participate. The Republic faced a recurring dilemma. Joining such coalitions could bring allies and moral support, but it also risked provoking retaliation that would endanger trade. Remaining aloof might preserve commerce, yet it could damage Venice's standing among other Christian states. While these choices were being weighed, the Ottomans continued to build up their own fleet. Shipyards along the Aegean and Marmara coasts produced galleys and later other types of warships. Experienced corsairs from North Africa and other regions entered Ottoman service, bringing with them skills in raiding and naval combat. In time, the sultans could deploy naval forces that rivaled or surpassed those of individual Italian cities. The balance that had once favored Venice, thanks to its arsenal and convoy system, became less clear. The long Cretan conflict in the 17th century, although belonging somewhat later in the chronology, illustrates the pattern that was taking shape already in earlier wars. Crete was one of Venice's most prized possessions, a large, fertile island strategically located between the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. Ottoman attempts to take the island led to a grinding war that stretched on for decades. While the detailed events of that conflict fall beyond the immediate time frame of this section, the underlying dynamic was established earlier, Venice defending a distant colony at enormous cost against a tenacious Ottoman siege, relying on naval dominance but gradually worn down by the sheer scale and persistence of its opponent. Even in earlier centuries, Venetian councils realized that no single victory at sea could permanently secure their position against an empire with such deep resources. What the Republic aimed for instead was a manageable balance: retain enough key ports to sustain its trade, keep open the lanes to Egypt and the Levant as long as possible, and avoid confrontations that might lead to complete exclusion. In practice, this meant alternating between fighting hard for particular strong points and accepting negotiated losses elsewhere when the cost of holding on became too great. The impact of these struggles on Venetian society was significant. War with the Ottomans demanded repeated mobilizations, and public debt rose as the state borrowed to fund campaigns. Patrician families felt the strain in their investments, and debates in the Great Council and Senate grew sharper over questions of strategy. Should Venice concentrate on defending a limited number of crucial colonies, or attempt to maintain a wider, more fragile network? How much sacrifice in trade and revenues was acceptable in the name of honor and prestige? Among ordinary people, tales of Ottoman sieges and naval battles mixed with reports of trade fluctuations and rising prices. The figure of the Ottoman Turk became a powerful presence in Venetian imagination, both feared and, in a complicated way, familiar. After all, many Venetian sailors, merchants, and diplomats had spent long periods in Ottoman lands, learned Turkish or other local languages, and formed working relationships with their counterparts. Art and literature of the time reveal a mixture of hostility, curiosity, and begrudging respect. From the Ottoman perspective, Venice was only one among several significant European powers, but it was a particularly visible one in the Mediterranean. The sultans dealt with the Habsburgs, the kingdoms of France and Poland, and other neighbors across many frontiers. Yet the Venetian presence on their maritime flanks demanded attention. Controlling or neutralizing Venetian bases could help secure the approaches to Istanbul and protect Ottoman communications with Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. Gradually, As war and negotiation repeated across decades, a new reality took shape. Venice remained a major naval and commercial power, but it no longer enjoyed the near unquestioned dominance it once had in parts of the eastern Mediterranean. The Ottomans had become the primary political and military force in the region. Venetian colonies shrank in number and shifted in character, from instruments of expansion to outposts to be held or surrendered depending on circumstances. By the later 15th and early 16th centuries, Venice still looked powerful from the perspective of the Adriatic and the eastern Mediterranean. Its galleys sailed to Alexandria and Cyprus, its merchants bargained in Istanbul and Damascus, and its patricians invested in estates on the mainland. Yet beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, a quiet revolution was underway. New oceanic routes were opening that would slowly undermine the foundations of Venetian sea power. For centuries, the Republic's prosperity had rested on a particular geography. Spices and other luxury goods traveled from the Indian Ocean into the Red Sea or Persian Gulf, then moved by caravan to ports controlled by Muslim rulers. From there, Italian and other Mediterranean merchants carried them to European markets. Venice thrived because it sat at the northern end of this chain, organizing transport, finance, and distribution. As long as the main flows of pepper, cinnamon, and other high-value goods passed through the eastern Mediterranean, Venetian ships and counting houses remained essential. That geography began to shift when Portuguese navigators, backed by their crown, pushed steadily down the west coast of Africa. Step by step, they mapped unfamiliar shores, founded forts and trading stations, and learned how to harness winds and currents for long ocean voyages. Eventually, they rounded the southern tip of Africa and reached the Indian Ocean. At almost the same time, Spanish expeditions crossed the Western Ocean and stumbled upon the Americas, opening entirely new trade possibilities in silver, sugar, and other products. At first, these developments might have seemed distant to Venetian observers. The Portuguese crown was a long way from the Lagoon, and the Atlantic ports of Lisbon and Seville felt far removed from the familiar world of Alexandria, Beirut, and Istanbul. But as reports accumulated, it became clear that something fundamental was changing. Instead of moving through traditional caravan routes and eastern Mediterranean ports, more and more spices and Asian goods began to travel directly by sea from the Indian Ocean to Atlantic harbors. European consumers could buy pepper and other wares in Lisbon or Antwerp without relying on merchants who passed through the Levant. Venice faced a difficult reality. It could not easily follow the Portuguese into the open Atlantic. The Republic's maritime expertise and ship designs were optimized for the Mediterranean, with galleys and round ships suited to coastal and semi-enclosed waters. Oceanic navigation demanded different vessels such as caravels and naus, better adapted to long voyages in rough seas, and a willingness to experiment with routes far from any coastline. Moreover, the Portuguese and Spanish crowns treated their new routes as royal monopolies, tightly controlling access and rewarding domestic elites who supported their ventures. At the same time, the Ottomans were consolidating their control over many of the regions that had supplied Venetian intermediaries. Their expansion into Syria, Egypt, and the Arabian hinterlands brought key transit points under a single imperial authority, which could adjust taxes, restrict certain trades, or favor alternative partners at will. In theory, this might have made eastern routes more predictable, but in practice it added another layer of dependence for Venice, whose merchants now had to negotiate with a powerful empire at precisely the moment when Atlantic competitors were finding ways to bypass that empire entirely. Venetian councils did not simply accept decline as inevitable. They explored ways to adapt. One response was to double down on what the Republic already did well: high-value manufacturing and regional trade. Venice had long been famous for its glassmaking, especially on the island of Murano. Its artisans produced mirrors, fine tableware, and later more complex optical and decorative pieces that were prized across Europe. By investing further in these industries, the city could export goods that were not easily replicated elsewhere, even if it no longer monopolized the spice trade. Textiles offered another avenue. Venetian workshops produced luxury fabrics, including velvets and damasks, that appealed to elites from Germany to the Iberian Peninsula. By importing raw silk and dyes, then adding skilled labor and design, the Republic could create value at home and sell finished products abroad. This strategy shifted the emphasis from acting purely as a carrier to acting also as a producer in its own right, less dependent on any single trade route. Finance and services likewise became more important. Venetian merchants and bankers had centuries of experience in handling complex transactions, ensuring cargoes, and arbitrating disputes. Even as direct spice trade decreased, there remained demand for such expertise. The city's location still made it a convenient meeting place for merchants from Central Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and various Italian states. Venice could act as a clearinghouse for bills of exchange, information, and specialized credit, even when its ships were no longer the main vehicles for distant goods. Diplomacy formed another line of adaptation. The Republic worked to maintain and, where possible, improve its relations with both the Ottoman court and Western monarchies. Venetian ambassadors in Istanbul, Lisbon, and other capitals watched developments closely, sending back detailed reports that helped the councils understand shifting balances. While Venice could not break the Portuguese monopoly on the route around Africa, it could negotiate for access to some of the products arriving in Atlantic ports, either through direct purchases or through trade via intermediate cities such as Antwerp. Yet, despite these efforts, the structural change was undeniable. Prices of certain spices in European markets reflected the new competition. When Portuguese imports increased, the relative value of pepper and similar goods tended to fall, squeezing profits for merchants still operating through eastern channels. Venetian convoys to Alexandria and Syria could no longer count on the same margins as before. Over time, some investors redirected their capital toward other ventures, including mainland estates, northern European trade, or urban property. Within Venice, this transition affected social and political life. Older generations of patricians who had made their reputations in Levantine trade sometimes struggled to accept the new reality. Younger members of the elite explored different paths, combining investment in land with participation in manufacturing and finance. The internal balance between families long associated with overseas ventures and those more rooted in the terra firma shifted in subtle ways, as influence increasingly flowed to those best placed to profit from the transformed economy. The changing trade geography also influenced how Venice viewed its maritime colonies. Bases that had once been essential staging points for spice convoys now had less direct economic justification. Islands like Cyprus still produced sugar and other valuable commodities, and fortresses in the Aegean continued to offer strategic depth against Ottoman and other naval threats. But when weighed against their maintenance costs and vulnerability to attack, their value had to be reassessed in a world where the most profitable flows of spices might be passing far to the west. This did not mean that the Eastern Mediterranean suddenly became irrelevant. There remained a lively trade in grain, cotton, tobacco, textiles, and many other goods. Venice continued to import cereals from the Black Sea when needed, to export manufactured items to eastern ports, and to move pilgrims and travelers of various kinds. Nonetheless, the symbolic and financial centrality of the region faded compared to the earlier centuries, when it had been the main gateway for Asian luxuries into Europe. Another area where Venice tried to respond was in knowledge and science. The city's printers published works on geography, navigation, and cosmography that described new lands and routes. Scholars and mapmakers in Venice collected information about Atlantic discoveries, incorporating them into increasingly accurate charts and globes. Even if Venetian ships were not leading the way across the ocean, Venetian minds were helping to make sense of the changing world. This intellectual engagement reflected a recognition that power would increasingly depend not only on inherited habits, but also on the ability to understand and adapt to global patterns. Despite such efforts, the Republic could not escape the strategic consequences of the westward shift. As more trade and wealth flowed through Atlantic ports, political power followed. Monarchies like those of Spain, Portugal, France, and later England gained resources from colonial ventures that they could use to fund armies and fleets in Europe. The old Italian and Mediterranean powers, including Venice, found themselves dealing with neighbors whose fiscal and military capacities were being transformed by overseas empires. This change affected the diplomatic environment in which Venice had to operate. Where once the Republic had been a central player in European coalitions, it now increasingly had to maneuver among larger powers whose interests sometimes overlapped with, and sometimes conflicted with, its own. The League of Cambrai, for example, in the early 16th century, brought together several major monarchs and the papacy in a coalition against Venetian territorial influence on the mainland. Although Venice eventually survived that crisis and recovered important positions, the episode underscored how vulnerable it had become to alliances forged beyond its control. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire remained a constant presence to the east. Even as Atlantic developments reshaped global trade, Ottoman expansion and consolidation continued to affect Venetian colonies and routes. Venice could not simply pivot away from the eastern Mediterranean, because its remaining overseas possessions and many of its trading partners were still there. Instead, the Republic found itself in a double squeeze, challenged by a powerful land-sea empire in one direction and by Atlantic-based colonial powers in the other. For ordinary Venetians, the effects of these shifts were gradual but real. Some sectors of the urban economy, especially those tied directly to Levantine spice trade, shrank or changed character. Others, such as luxury manufacturing and local services, remained robust or even grew. The city still attracted visitors, pilgrims, and merchants, and its streets and canals remained busy. Yet behind the daily bustle lay a sense that the world had moved slightly out of alignment with the structures that had once made Venice supreme. When people remember Venice as a naval power in its later centuries, one image often comes to mind: long lines of galleys, flags snapping in the wind, closing with an Ottoman fleet in the narrow waters near Lepanto. The battle itself took place in the later 16th century, but it drew on centuries of Venetian experience with ships, convoys, and maritime diplomacy. It also revealed the limits of what even a great victory at sea could achieve in a world whose economic center of gravity was already shifting elsewhere. By the time of Lepanto, the relationship between Venice and the Ottoman Empire had become a pattern of uneasy coexistence broken by violent episodes. The Republic still traded in Ottoman ports and maintained an ambassador at the Sultan's court. At the same time, it had lost key strongholds and watched as the Ottomans tightened their hold on the eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus, one of Venice's most valuable overseas possessions, now became a focal point of tension. Cyprus was important for several reasons. It was large and fertile, producing sugar, cotton, and other goods. Its position gave Venice a forward base in the eastern Mediterranean, within reach of the Levantine coast and relatively close to routes toward Egypt and Anatolia. For the Ottomans, the island was a tempting target. Its conquest would remove a Christian outpost near their heartlands and further secure maritime lines between their ports. When Ottoman forces launched a major campaign against Cyprus, Venetian defenders and local populations mounted a stubborn resistance in key fortresses, especially Nicosia and Famagusta. The defense of Famagusta, led on the Venetian side by Marcantonio Bragadin, became particularly famous for its endurance and tragic end. But even heroic stands could not change the balance of power. The island fell, and reports of harsh treatment of the defeated spread quickly through Christian Europe. This loss created intense pressure on Venice. The Republic had just seen one of its most important colonies taken by force. Its honor was wounded, its strategic position weakened, and its citizens angry and anxious. Yet Venice could not hope to face the Ottomans alone on equal terms at sea. To mount a credible response, it needed powerful allies. The wider European context now came into play. The Spanish monarchy, ruling vast territories including much of Italy and a rapidly growing American empire, also feared Ottoman naval power, especially in the western Mediterranean. The papacy, concerned for the defense of Christian lands and the balance of power, pushed for a broad coalition. Through complex negotiations, a holy league was formed that brought together Spain, Venice, and papal forces, along with other Italian contingents. It was an alliance of states with different interests, but a shared desire to check Ottoman expansion. For Venice, joining the Holy League was not a simple decision. War on this scale would be expensive and risky. Any fleet committed to a major battle could not simultaneously protect every convoy or colonial outpost. But the loss of Cyprus and the prospect of further Ottoman advances left few good alternatives. The councils decided that the Republic would contribute a large number of galleys and experience in maritime logistics, even though this meant stretching its resources. The Allied fleet gathered under the overall command of Don John of Austria, the half-brother of the Spanish king. Venetian admirals, including Sebastiano Venier, brought deep knowledge of galley warfare and the eastern waters. The combined armada represented an impressive concentration of naval force. Spanish, Venetian, Papal, and other Italian ships pulled together for a single decisive encounter. Opposing them, the Ottomans assembled their own powerful fleet, led by Ali Pasha, drawing vessels and crews from across their empire and from North African corsair centers. The two fleets finally met in the Gulf of Patras, near the port of Lepanto. The battle that followed was one of the largest oared galley engagements ever fought. On the Christian side, Venetian ships formed a central element of the line, with their long experience of coordinated maneuvers. The fighting quickly turned chaotic and brutal. Galleys rammed one another, lashes and grappling irons bound ships side by side, and Marines fought hand-to-hand on crowded decks. Cannons mounted in the bows roared at close range, and archers and musketeers added to the noise and destruction. In the thick of the combat, individual acts of courage and tragedy were numerous, but the overall pattern slowly favored the Holy League. Better coordination among the Christian squadrons, combined with effective use of artillery and heavy infantry on the decks, began to break the cohesion of the Ottoman line. The death of Ali Pasha and the capture of his flagship had a powerful demoralizing effect on his forces. By the end of the day, the Ottoman fleet was largely shattered. Many of its galleys were sunk, burned, or captured, and a significant number of Christian galley slaves were freed from their benches. News of the victory spread rapidly through Europe. For many contemporaries, Lepanto appeared as a turning point, a proof that Ottoman expansion at sea was not unstoppable. In Venice, celebrations filled the city. The Republic's participation in the victory helped restore some of the prestige lost with the fall of Cyprus. Artistic and literary works commemorated the battle, and the names of commanders were added to the long roll of Venetian naval heroes. The memory of Lepanto would echo in Venetian culture for generations. Yet, when we look closely at the consequences, a more complex picture emerges. Strategically, Lepanto did not fundamentally alter the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. The Ottomans, although dealt a heavy blow, retained their coastal strongholds and their continental base. They rebuilt their fleet within a relatively short time, drawing on the vast resources of their empire. The Holy League alliance, meanwhile, was fragile. Each member had its own priorities, and once the immediate objective had been met, the coalition's unity loosened. For Venice, the huge effort required to send and support a large fleet had been a serious strain. Ships had to be replaced or repaired, crews paid, and casualties compensated. The Republic had poured resources into a single climactic confrontation and emerged with glory, but without recovering Cyprus or gaining new permanent positions. In later years, Venetian statesmen would look back on Lepanto with mixed feelings, proud of the achievement, but conscious that it had not reversed the long-term trend of Ottoman strength and Venetian contraction in the region. Economically, the victory did not restore the old conditions of the spice trade. Atlantic routes continued to grow in importance, and the Ottomans still controlled the main Muslim ports of the eastern Mediterranean. Venetian merchants could, and did, go on trading in those ports under new treaties, but their leverage was limited. The great convoys to the Levant and Egypt remained part of the Republic's pattern, but they existed within a wider world where Lisbon, Seville, and later Amsterdam and London played increasingly central roles. What Lepanto did change, in a more lasting way, was perception. It reinforced the idea of Venice as an indispensable naval ally in European eyes. Even as its relative economic position declined, the Republic retained a reputation for maritime expertise and disciplined galley warfare. This reputation would influence diplomatic calculations well into the 17th century, as other powers considered Venice a useful partner in any coalition involving the Mediterranean. Within the city, the battle contributed to a developing narrative of Venice as a bulwark of Christian Europe against Eastern threats. Public ceremonies, paintings, and histories highlighted the Republic's role in defending not only its own interests, but also the wider community of Latin Christendom. This self-image helped justify ongoing military expenditures and the maintenance of a strong, if increasingly defensive, fleet. It also provided a kind of moral compensation for the harsher realities of shrinking colonies and changing trade patterns. At the same time, the experience of Lepanto underscored a sobering lesson for Venetian leaders. Even when the Republic mobilized its full strength and combined it with that of powerful allies, victories at sea could not permanently solve the structural problems Venice faced. The long-term pressures of Ottoman territorial control and Atlantic commercial shifts could be mitigated but not undone by a single battle, however dramatic. This realization contributed to a more cautious, preservation-oriented strategy in subsequent decades. In the years after Lepanto, Venice focused increasingly on holding what it still possessed rather than on bold, new expansions. Fortifications in the Adriatic and around remaining island possessions were improved. The emphasis in naval planning shifted from large coalition fleets to flexible squadrons capable of patrolling, escorting, and defending key points. The arsenal continued to function as the heart of Venetian sea power, but its work was now more often directed toward maintaining a defensive shield than toward supporting aggressive campaigns deep into the eastern Mediterranean. The social impact of these changes was subtle but real. For centuries, opportunities for glory and profit in distant wars and adventurous convoys had been part of what drew young men from patrician and citizen families into maritime service. As those horizons narrowed, the political and economic life of the Republic turned more inward. The mainland estates of the Terraferma and the urban economy of the Lagoon city took on relatively greater importance compared to far-flung colonies. After the Great Clash at Lepanto, Venice stood at a crossroads. The Republic had shown that it could still gather fleets, strike hard, and win admiration across Europe. Yet the deeper realities did not change. Ottoman power remained strong, Atlantic routes continued to pull trade away from the Mediterranean, and the cost of maintaining distant colonies rose year by year. In this new world, Venice gradually shifted from an expansive maritime republic to a power focused on defense, careful diplomacy, and the slow management of decline. This shift did not happen overnight. In the generations after Lepanto, Venetian councils still spoke the language of honor, Christian solidarity, and maritime glory. But when they drew up budgets, reviewed fleet reports, and read dispatches from distant governors, a more cautious calculus emerged. The question was less how to expand and more how to hold what remained without exhausting the state. One of the clearest signs of this new priority was the enormous effort devoted to fortifications. Venetian engineers and military architects, drawing on the latest ideas in bastioned trace design, transformed many colonies and mainland positions into complex defensive systems. Thick angled walls, earthen ramparts, ravelins, and outworks were built to resist not only traditional sieges, but also the growing power of artillery. In the Adriatic, strong points such as Zara and the ports along the Dalmatian coast were reinforced to secure the approaches to the lagoon. In the eastern Mediterranean, islands and harbors still under Venetian control were ringed with new walls and batteries. Crete, the great Venetian island that had long been one of the jewels of the Maritime Empire, became the focus of the most dramatic and costly example of this defensive turn. The island's capital, Candia, already fortified, was further strengthened as relations with the Ottomans deteriorated. When war finally broke out in the 17th century, Crete became the scene of a prolonged struggle that lasted for decades and tested the limits of Venetian endurance. Ottoman forces landed on Crete with the aim of seizing the island and ending Venetian presence there. They quickly occupied large portions of the countryside, but Candia and a few other strongholds held out. What followed was an exceptionally long siege of the capital, in which Venetian garrisons, reinforced at intervals by fleets and foreign volunteers, resisted repeated assaults, bombardments, and mining operations. The defenders repaired walls, dug countermines, and endured disease and shortages. The Ottomans, for their part, poured men and resources into the campaign, determined to break Venetian resistance. This grueling war illustrates the character of Venetian power in this period. The Republic could no longer rely on quick, decisive victories or aggressive expansion. Instead, it fought to delay the loss of key positions as long as possible, hoping that alliances, European politics, or sheer exhaustion might eventually produce a compromise. The defense of Candia won admiration across Europe, and the city's endurance became a symbol of steadfastness. But in the end, after immense suffering and expense, the fortress fell. Crete passed into Ottoman hands, and Venice lost one of its last major island colonies in the eastern Mediterranean. The consequences were severe. The long Cretan conflict had drained the treasury, increased public debt, and cost countless lives at sea and on land. Yet, even this painful experience did not lead the Republic simply to abandon its remaining possessions. Instead, it narrowed its focus to a smaller set of strategic points, especially in the Adriatic and Ionian seas. Islands like Corfu and a chain of fortified ports along the eastern shore of the Adriatic became the new backbone of a reduced maritime empire. These bastions protected approaches to the lagoon and allowed Venice to maintain a presence in waters now otherwise dominated by Ottoman and, increasingly, other European ships. Diplomacy became as important as walls and cannons. Venetian ambassadors in Istanbul, Vienna, Paris, and other capitals worked tirelessly to keep the Republic out of unwinnable conflicts and to secure recognition of its remaining territories. The state's long experience with negotiations, treaties, and commercial agreements now served primarily to preserve independence and a shrinking sphere of influence. Venice often tried to position itself as a neutral or balancing power, avoiding permanent alignment with any single great monarchy while leveraging its strategic location and diplomatic skill. This role as a cautious mediator was visible in the way Venice handled the complex wars of the 17th century. When great coalitions formed to contest dominance in Central and Western Europe, the Republic generally avoided deep entanglement. It might provide limited support, offer its territory as a place for talks, or act as a channel of communication, but it rarely committed itself fully to campaigns far from its own core interests. This restraint reflected both prudence and necessity. The resources required simply to defend the mainland frontiers and maritime bastions left little margin for adventurism. On the mainland, Venice also adopted a more conservative stance. The era of major territorial expansion into the terraferma was over. Instead, the Republic focused on consolidating its existing domains, improving administration, and balancing rural and urban interests. Venetian governors on the mainland worked to maintain order, manage taxation, and prevent local elites from drawing the Republic into conflicts that could provoke powerful neighbors. The threat now came less from ambitious Milanese lords and more from the large dynastic states to the north and west, especially the Habsburgs, whose lands bordered the Venetian mainland. Economically, the transformation into a defensive empire had mixed effects. On the one hand, the loss of Crete and earlier island colonies reduced the direct agricultural and commercial resources available to the state. On the other hand, Venice's mainland territories continued to produce grain, wine, and other goods, while the city itself remained a lively center of craftsmanship, printing, and luxury production. Trade with the Levant and Ottoman ports did not disappear. It adapted. Venetian merchants shifted more toward regional exchanges, niche, high-value goods, and financial services. The city still hosted foreign traders, though in smaller numbers, and its role as a cultural and intellectual center even grew. Indeed, one of the paradoxes of this era is that Venice's artistic and cultural life flourished, even as its strategic and economic position slowly weakened. Baroque churches, public buildings, and palaces rose along the canals. Painters, composers, and scholars found patrons among patrician families whose fortunes were increasingly tied to land and to internal commerce rather than to daring maritime ventures. The myth of Venice as a serene, harmonious republic guided by wise laws and balanced institutions was polished and displayed to visitors from across Europe. This carefully crafted image, however, could not entirely conceal underlying tensions. Public debt remained high, and debates in the councils about taxation, military spending, and administrative reform grew sharper. Some patricians grumbled that the cost of defending remote bastions was no longer justified. Others warned that abandoning too many positions would leave the republic exposed and invite further encroachment. The challenge lay in finding a balance between necessary retrenchment and dangerous retreat. The population structure of the city also shifted. As long-distance maritime trade declined and the fleet's offensive missions decreased, opportunities for sailors and related workers changed. Many still found employment in coastal defense, local shipping, and fishing. But the heroic age of great state convoys and distant campaigns felt further away. Meanwhile, craftsmen, artisans, and service workers connected to the mainland economy or to urban consumption retained or gained importance. Venice was becoming less a headquarters of a vast maritime network and more a specialized urban center embedded in a more modest regional system. Relations with the Ottomans remained central to this entire period. Even after the fall of Crete, Venice and the Porta negotiated new settlements that allowed trade to resume on adjusted terms. Periods of tension and shorter conflicts punctuated these relations, but there was a growing recognition on both sides that total confrontation served neither party well. The Ottomans had their own challenges, facing Habsburg pressure in Central Europe, internal revolts, and the growing presence of other European navies in their waters. Venice could still offer useful commercial links and a degree of stability in the Adriatic. At the same time, new naval players were entering the Mediterranean. Dutch and English ships appeared more frequently, sometimes trading directly with Ottoman and North African ports. French naval power also grew, backed by a centralized monarchy with colonial ambitions. For Venice, these newcomers presented a mixed picture. They could be partners in commerce and occasional allies in balancing Ottoman power, but they were also competitors for influence and markets. The Mediterranean was no longer the nearly closed system in which Venice had once been preeminent. It was now one theater among many in a wider European and global struggle. In this crowded environment, the Republic leaned increasingly on its reputation for legal order and neutrality. Foreign merchants and diplomats valued Venice as a place where disputes could be arbitrated and contracts enforced reliably. The city's laws, courts, and notarial culture made it a trusted venue for complex deals. Even as its naval reach shrank, Venice's institutional strength remained impressive. This institutional continuity helped sustain its independence long after its ability to dominate sea lanes had faded. By the late 18th century, Venice looked on the surface, serene and unchanging. The bells still rang over the lagoon, processions still wound through St. Mark's Square, and the Great Council still convened beneath painted ceilings that celebrated past victories. But behind this ceremonial calm, the Republic was increasingly out of step with a Europe entering an age of revolutions and mass armies. The Maritime Empire had shrunk to a chain of defensive outposts. The mainland territories were valuable but vulnerable, and the political system, designed for careful adjustment, struggled to respond to sudden shocks. Those shocks arrived from across the Alps. The French Revolution overturned the old monarchy and unleashed wars that rapidly spread through Europe. Revolutionary France, and then France under the rising General Napoleon Bonaparte, mobilized armies on a scale that older Italian states could scarcely imagine. Ideology and military ambition combined. The language of liberty and popular sovereignty marched alongside artillery and conscription. In this world, Venice's long-standing strategy of prudent neutrality faced a severe test. For centuries, the Republic had avoided deep entanglement in continental conflicts, preferring to act as mediator and neutral ground. Ambassadors from rival powers lived side by side in the city, and Venice often hosted negotiations that ended wars between others. The patrician elite took pride in this role, seeing neutrality as both moral stance and practical shield. They remembered how previous alliances had drawn other Italian states into ruinous wars, and believed that staying above the fray was the surest way to preserve independence. When French revolutionary armies began to advance into northern Italy, Venice tried to apply the same logic. The Republic declared its neutrality, refusing to open its ports and roads exclusively to either the Habsburg monarchy or to France. At first, both sides tolerated this, so long as Venetian territory could serve as a buffer and, occasionally, as a convenient passage. But as Napoleon's Italian campaigns intensified, neutrality became harder to maintain in practice. Napoleon understood the strategic value of the Venetian mainland. Roads and passes that crossed those territories could facilitate rapid movement of troops between the Alps and the Po Valley. Moreover, Venice's forts and garrisons, though not formidable by the standards of the new mass warfare, still controlled bridges, river crossings, and key towns. The French general was not inclined to let an old oligarchic republic limit his operational freedom. At the same time, the ideas of the revolution began to circulate among segments of the population in Venice's mainland cities. In places such as Bergamo, Brescia, and Verona, some citizens resented patrician rule and saw in French victories a chance to overturn existing structures. Revolutionary clubs sprang up, pamphlets circulated, and local uprisings broke out. These movements did not speak for everyone, but they created instability behind Venetian lines and offered Napoleon potential allies. As the French advanced and Habsburg armies retreated or regrouped, Venice's position became more precarious. On the one hand, Austrian forces occasionally crossed Venetian territory, sometimes without clear permission, in attempts to maneuver against the French. On the other hand, French troops pressed close to Venetian borders, demanding supplies and passage. The Republic protested violations of its neutrality to both sides, but lacked the military power to enforce its protests on the ground. The situation deteriorated further when clashes occurred between Venetian forces and French units in the mainland territories. In some towns, local resistance to French occupation involved Venetian soldiers and citizens in fighting that Napoleon could portray as hostile acts by the Republic itself. A particular incident involving an attack on a French vessel near the Lagoon became a pretext for open accusation. Whether or not Venice had intended a deliberate provocation mattered less than the general's assessment that the old Republic was no longer a useful neutral, but an obstacle. Napoleon moved swiftly. French troops occupied more mainland towns, and revolutionary committees proclaimed new sister republics under French protection, effectively stripping Venice of control over parts of its terra firma. In proclamations and letters, the French leadership denounced the Venetian government as corrupt and tyrannical, accusing it of plotting against the French and suppressing the liberty of its own subjects. The language of revolution thus combined with military force to delegitimize the oligarchic regime. Inside Venice, panic and division grew. The Doge, Ludovico Manin, presided over a patriciate unaccustomed to decisive, risky action. For generations, the Great Council had managed gradual change and guarded a fragile balance among noble families. Now it faced an external enemy willing to use overwhelming force, and internal unrest stirred up in the name of liberty. Some council members urged resistance, arguing that the fleet, fortified positions, and the loyalty of many citizens could still offer a chance to defend the Lagoon. Others, recalling the devastation that modern armies could inflict and fearing social upheaval, counseled caution or even accommodation. Napoleon increased the pressure with blunt demands. He called for the abolition of the old institutions, the disarming of Venetian forces, and the acceptance of a new order aligned with French interests. French warships appeared near the Lagoon, and troops stood just beyond the fragile line of defenses. At the same time, rumors spread of Jacobin sympathizers within the city ready to support radical change. The patrician regime felt besieged not only from outside but from within. In the spring of the late 18th century, Under this intense strain, the Great Council met for what would be one of its final sessions. The choice presented was stark: attempt to resist, almost certainly inviting bombardment, occupation, and perhaps internal revolution, or accept French demands and dissolve the 1,000-year-old republic. The atmosphere in the chamber was heavy. Many understood that whatever decision they made, the old Venice was unlikely to survive in its traditional form. The vote went in favor of yielding. The Doge, Ludovico Manin, abdicated, marking the end of a long line of heads of state that stretched back to the early Middle Ages. The patrician government resigned itself to the creation of a provisional municipality under French control. Venetian symbols of sovereignty, such as the golden standard of St. Mark, were lowered. The Serenissima, as the Republic had called itself, was no more. Yet even this surrender did not guarantee a future under French patronage. Napoleon had larger plans. In subsequent negotiations with the Habsburg monarchy, the French leadership treated Venetian territories as bargaining chips. In the Treaty of Campo Formio, Venice and its mainland, along with Istrian and Dalmatian possessions, were handed over to Austria, while France secured other gains, including recognition of its influence in parts of northern Italy and beyond. The once independent Maritime Republic thus passed without a battle in its own canals, from self-rule to the status of a prize exchanged between empires. Under Austrian rule, Venice experienced a different kind of governance. The city was integrated into a centralized monarchical system with its own bureaucratic norms. Some aspects of administration became more modern and uniform. Others felt alien and heavy-handed to Venetians, accustomed to their own legal and political traditions. The great councils no longer met, and decisions affecting the city came increasingly from distant capitals. Yet daily life continued in many ways. Trade, though reduced, did not cease. Artisans worked. Gondolas still crossed the canals. The story did not end there. The Napoleonic Wars brought further reversals. When French power resurged in Italy under new arrangements, Venice again came under French control, this time as part of a satellite kingdom that adopted some reforms inspired by revolutionary and Napoleonic models. Later, with the defeat of Napoleon, the city returned once more to Austrian hands at the Congress of Vienna. Each transition chipped away at old habits and introduced new legal codes, economic policies, and administrative structures. Throughout these changes, the Maritime Empire that had once defined Venice's place in the world slipped further into the past. The Republic's former colonies were divided among new rulers. The Ionian Islands, for example, followed their own complex path under shifting international arrangements. Dalmatian and Istrian coasts became part of wider Habsburg domains. The sea, once crisscrossed by Venetian convoys, now saw ships flying many different flags, serving the commercial and strategic aims of rising nation-states and imperial powers. Within Venice, memories of the old republic remained vivid among those who had lived through its final years and among their descendants. Some looked back with nostalgia, idealizing the stability and relative independence of the previous centuries. Others, influenced by new political ideas, criticized the oligarchic system as stagnant and exclusive. Intellectuals and patriots of the 19th century debated whether Venice should be seen primarily as a lost empire, a symbol of aristocratic oppression, or a unique experiment in republican government. When the Venetian Republic finally disappeared from the map, its ships no longer controlling trade routes or blockading enemy ports, it might have seemed that its story was over. Yet, in many ways, the end of political independence was the beginning of a different kind of influence. Venice, the Maritime Republic, survived not as a state with colonies and convoys, but as an example, an archive, and a symbol. The ideas and institutions created over many centuries of life as a sea power continued to shape how later generations thought about commerce, law, and strategy on the oceans. One of the clearest legacies lies in the field of commercial law and practice. From early on, Venetian merchants had relied on written contracts to govern complex relationships, partnerships that split profits between investors and traveling agents. insurance agreements that covered risks of storms and pirates, and charter parties that set out obligations of ship owners and cargo owners. Notaries recorded these documents in meticulous detail, and the state enforced them through a system of courts and magistrates. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain clauses became standard, particular ways of allocating risk were repeated, and specific forms of partnership were recognized as legitimate and effective. These practices did not remain confined to the Lagoon. Merchants from other regions encountered Venetian methods in ports across the Mediterranean and carried similar techniques home. As European commerce expanded in later centuries, elements of this legal culture influenced broader developments in commercial and maritime law. The idea that trade could be governed by predictable written rules rather than by arbitrary power was central to this legacy. Venice showed that a state whose rulers were themselves merchants could create institutions that balanced private initiative with public oversight. This was not a modern capitalist democracy, but it was an early example of a polity where contracts mattered at every level, from small ventures to state-backed convoys. Later, theorists of commerce and finance, looking back, saw in the Venetian experience a laboratory for understanding how markets and law interact. Public finance was another area where the Republic left a mark. The Venetian system of funded public debt, in which citizens lent money to the state in return for regular interest payments, anticipated later forms of government borrowing in larger European monarchies. By spreading the cost of war and defense over many years and many investors, Venice could build fleets and fortifications beyond what its annual tax income alone might have supported. This practice helped demonstrate both the potential and the dangers of long-term public debt as a tool of statecraft. Strategists and historians of sea power also drew lessons from the Venetian story. Long before modern naval theorists wrote about the relationship between commerce, fleets, and national strength, Venice had demonstrated that control of sea lanes could make a small territory wealthy and influential. The Republic's rise from lagoon settlements to a maritime empire showed how geography, when combined with shipbuilding capacity and disciplined administration, could substitute for a lack of fertile land or large population. Later thinkers, especially in the age of global empires, often looked to larger examples such as Britain when discussing naval supremacy. Yet Venice remained an important case study, particularly for those interested in how a state might balance the demands of trade and war. The Venetian habit of treating naval campaigns as extensions of commercial policy rather than as purely military adventures resonated with later ideas about the protection of merchant shipping and the use of blockades and convoys. Within Italy and Europe more broadly, the Republic's political system offered another kind of legacy. The oligarchic republic with its councils, ducal oath, and mechanisms for checking individual ambition became a reference point in debates about mixed government. Early modern writers fascinated by the stability of Venice contrasted it with the turbulence of other Italian cities and the absolutism of certain monarchies. They described the Republic as a harmonious blend of monarchical, aristocratic, and popular elements, even if in practice the patrician class dominated. These writings, whether idealized or critical, shaped how later generations understood the possibilities and limits of republican government. Some Enlightenment thinkers praised Venice as an example of long-lasting constitutional order. Others condemned it as a closed, conservative oligarchy. Either way, the Venetian case forced them to grapple with questions about who should govern, how power should be balanced, and how a state might preserve liberty, however defined, over long periods. For the people living in Venice after the fall of the Republic, the legacy felt more concrete. The physical city itself was a vast archive of the maritime past. Arsenals, fondacy, customs houses, and warehouses stood as reminders of a time when galleys and merchantmen crowded the lagoon. Churches displayed ex votos from sailors thankful for survival at sea. Palaces along the Grand Canal had facades decorated with heraldry that recalled ancestors who had served as admirals, governors of distant islands, or ambassadors in far-off courts. As the 19th century progressed and the city became a destination for travelers and artists, this landscape acquired a new meaning. Visitors from Northern Europe and beyond were drawn to Venice not for its role in current politics, but for its atmosphere of layered history. Painters captured reflections of palaces in the water. Writers described the interplay of beauty and decay. The Maritime Empire, which had once been a living structure of convoys and colonial garrisons, turned into a set of stories that could be consumed as art and memory. This transformation had practical consequences. As industrialization and new transport technologies altered European economies, Venice found a different niche, that of a cultural and touristic center. The same canals and buildings that had served as tools and trophies of a trading state became the backdrop for a new kind of economy based on visitors, performances, and preservation. The city's identity as a former maritime republic became part of its appeal, a narrative that visitors encountered in guidebooks, museums, and guided walks. At the same time, scholars began to mine the archives of the old republic. Venice had always been a state that wrote a great deal, and many of its records survived. Historians of law, economics, diplomacy, and social life discovered in the stored documents a wealth of information about contracts, voyages, court cases, council debates, and everyday business. The detailed minutes of Senate meetings, the instructions to ambassadors, and the ledgers of merchants allowed later generations to reconstruct aspects of the Maritime Empire in remarkable detail. This scholarly work further enhanced Venice's role as a reference point. Studies of early capitalism, of the rise of European trade, and of state formation increasingly had to reckon with Venetian evidence. The Republic's archives showed how a pre-industrial society could develop complex financial instruments, manage large-scale cooperative enterprises like the Convoy System, and sustain a bureaucracy capable of tracking far-flung activities. The lessons drawn from this research influenced not only historians, but also economists and political scientists interested in the long-term evolution of institutions. Modern debates about environmental vulnerability have also found material in the Venetian experience. The city's relationship with its lagoon was always delicate. Maintaining channels, preventing silting, and balancing fresh and salt water required constant intervention. The very existence of Venice depended on managing a complex ecosystem. Today, as rising sea levels and climate change threaten low-lying coastal areas around the world, the history of Venetian efforts to live with water has gained renewed relevance. Engineers and planners study the long record of attempts to control tides and floods, even as new technologies are brought to bear on old problems. In a broader sense, Venice offers a case study in the life cycle of a commercial great power. It rose thanks to a fortunate location, timely alliances, and institutional creativity. It flourished by turning trade routes into a coherent system and by using its navy to protect and extend that system. It adapted to new challenges for a surprisingly long time, shifting from expansion to defense and from dominance to managed decline. Eventually, however, changes in technology, global trade patterns, and the scale of warfare created conditions that its structures could no longer fully meet. For contemporary audiences, this trajectory prompts questions that go beyond the particular story of the lagoon. How do states built on economic networks cope when those networks shift? What happens when the institutions that once provided stability become obstacles to necessary change? How long can a system based on continuous growth maintain itself before external or internal pressures force transformation? Venice's experience does not provide simple answers, but it offers a rich set of examples and warnings. There is also a more personal dimension to the legacy. When someone walks today across the Rialto Bridge or stands in the shadow of the Arsenal's gate, they are moving through spaces shaped by countless decisions made by sailors, merchants, officials, and workers. The stones carry the imprint of a society that tied its fate to the sea and accepted the risks that came with that choice. Understanding the Venetian Maritime Empire means not only tracing high politics and major battles, but also imagining the lives of those who rowed in the galleys, kept the accounts, argued in the courts, and negotiated in distant markets. In this way, the the story of Venice remains alive. The Republic no longer sends fleets out past the Lido, and its banners no longer fly over island fortresses across the eastern Mediterranean. Yet its influence persists in legal concepts, in scholarly debates, in strategic thinking, and in the very image of what a maritime city can be. The rise and fall of the Venetian Maritime Empire show how a community born in marshes and mudflats turned geography into opportunity, how it used institutions to transform commerce into power, and how, despite all efforts, it eventually had to yield to forces larger than itself. What remains is the chance to learn. By studying Venice, we can see more clearly the connections between trade and war, law and liberty, environment and empire. The Lagoon city thus continues to act as a kind of mirror in which later ages, including our own, can glimpse possibilities and limits, ambitions and vulnerabilities of any society that seeks its fortune on the sea.